Hey there, history enthusiasts. Tonight, we're venturing into one of humanity's most brutal and unforgiving lifestyles, the world of Germanic barbarian warriors during the height of Roman expansion. Forget the romanticized Viking sagas and noble, savage fantasies you've seen in movies. We're talking about a society where conflict resolution involved trial by combat, where your morning routine included sharpening weapons for raids that might start because someone looked at your cattle wrong, and where dying gloriously in battle wasn't just honorable, it was literally your best career advancement opportunity. This is the reality behind barbarian tribal life, a world where civilization was what happened to other people, where personal honor mattered more than personal survival, and where your daily existence revolved around preparing for wars with neighbors who viewed property ownership as a temporary arrangement subject to revision through violence. We're about to experience what it actually meant to live in wooden longhouses that doubled as fortress compounds, to survive on a warrior economy based on organized theft disguised as military valor, and to navigate social hierarchies where your status depended entirely on how effectively you could kill people with sharp metal objects. So settle in, brace yourself for some uncomfortable truths about pre-civilization life, and prepare for a journey into a world where individual courage was everything, tribal loyalty was absolute, and the difference between legendary warrior and decorative skull usually came down to how well you could swing sharp objects while avoiding having them swung at you by people who'd been practicing longer. Welcome to the world where honor was earned through bloodshed, where weakness meant death, and where the warrior's greatest achievement was dying so gloriously that people would sing about it around fires for generations. Congratulations! You've just been inducted into a Germanic barbarian tribe during the height of the Roman Empire's expansion into Northern Europe. The good news, you're now part of one of history's most feared warrior cultures, where personal combat prowess determines social status and dying gloriously in battle guarantees eternal honor in the warrior's afterlife. The bad news, your life expectancy just dropped to somewhere between impressively brief and creatively violent, and you'll be living in a society where conflict resolution involves trial by combat. Diplomatic negotiations happen at sword point, and your biggest career advancement opportunity involves fighting Roman legions who've made it their professional mission to turn barbarian territories into Roman provinces with better roads and higher taxes. Welcome to barbarian tribal life, where civilization is what happens to other people, honor is more important than survival, and your daily routine involves preparing for wars that might start because someone looked at someone else's cattle with insufficient respect. You're about to discover that everything Hollywood taught you about noble savages living in harmony with nature was complete romanticism, and the reality involves a lot more mud, violence, and arguing over who gets to keep the heads of defeated enemies as decorative trophies. You're standing in a tribal settlement somewhere in the forests of Germania, surrounded by wooden longhouses that serve as both family homes and fortress compounds during the frequent raids that characterize barbarian social interaction. The village itself is a collection of structures designed around the principle that everything valuable should be easily defended against neighbors who view property ownership as a temporary arrangement subject to revision through violence. Your new tribal family consists of extended kinship groups whose relationships determine everything from marriage eligibility to military obligations. The warrior band you've joined includes professional fighters whose loyalty is personal rather than institutional, and whose expectations about leadership include generous distribution of plunder, regular opportunities for glory, and the kind of tactical competence that keeps warriors alive long enough to enjoy their spoils. The social hierarchy operates on principles that combine hereditary status with demonstrated combatability, creating a system where noble birth provides advantages but personal prowess determines actual influence. Chieftains lead through a combination of inherited authority and proven capability in warfare, while warriors earn status through successful raids, honorable conduct in battle, and the accumulation of wealth that demonstrates their effectiveness as professional killers. Your living accommodations consist of shared space in a longhouse where privacy doesn't exist, and personal property includes whatever you can defend against family members who might view your possessions as potential inheritance opportunities. The longhouse serves multiple functions: residence, meeting hall, storage facility, and defensive position during attacks by hostile neighbors who've decided that diplomatic solutions are less efficient than armed robbery. The daily routine revolves around preparing for conflict while managing the agricultural and craft activities that support warrior society. When not actively raiding or defending against raids, tribal members engage in farming, animal husbandry, metalworking, and various productive activities that generate the wealth necessary to support professional warriors and their expensive equipment. Your fellow warriors represent a diverse collection of men whose careers involve killing people for personal honor, tribal glory, and material gain. Some are young fighters seeking to establish reputations through heroic deeds. Others are veteran raiders whose scars tell stories about previous military adventures. All share the understanding that warrior culture demands courage, skill, and the willingness to die fighting rather than live in dishonor. The economic system operates on principles that combine agriculture, craftsmanship, and organized theft through raids against neighboring tribes and expeditions into Roman territory. Successful military ventures provide wealth that supports tribal prosperity, while unsuccessful ones result in economic hardship that affects everyone's survival prospects. The legal framework consists of customary law enforced through assemblies of free warriors who settle disputes according to traditional precedents and personal combat when consensus proves elusive. Justice isn't abstract legal theory. It's practical problem-solving that maintains tribal cohesion while providing outlets for individual grievances that might otherwise escalate into blood feuds. And here's the beautiful irony. You're joining a warrior culture that prizes individual heroism and personal honor while preparing to fight Romans whose military system emphasizes unit discipline and coordinated tactics that have conquered most of the known world through superior organization rather than individual courage. Sleep well in your shared longhouse, because tomorrow you'll begin learning why barbarian warriors have reputations that make civilized armies nervous, and why Roman generals spend sleepless nights planning campaigns against enemies who consider death in battle to be a career achievement rather than an occupational hazard. Dawn in a barbarian settlement announces itself through the sounds of weapons being sharpened, livestock complaining about their accommodations, and someone discovering that the tribal council member who questioned the chief's raid planning has mysteriously developed a fatal case of sword poisoning during the night. Time to begin your education in professional barbarism, where every day brings new opportunities to prove your courage while avoiding the kind of career-ending mistakes that turn promising warriors into decorative skulls. Your morning briefing covers overnight developments in the complex network of tribal relationships that determine whether your people feast on Roman grain or become Roman slave labor. Scouts report unusual activity along the frontier, where Roman patrols have been probing tribal territories. A neighboring clan has been raiding cattle from villages under your tribe's protection, creating honor debts that must be settled through appropriately violent responses. 3 rival warriors have challenged each other to combat over distribution of spoils from the last successful raid. The weapon inspection begins your daily routine, because barbarian warfare depends on personal equipment maintained through individual responsibility and tribal craftsmanship. Your spear must be checked for loose bindings, cracked shafts, or damaged points that could fail during critical moments. The sword requires edge maintenance, grip security, and balance verification that ensures reliable performance when your life depends on metalworking quality. Shield condition affects both personal survival and unit effectiveness, because barbarian tactics rely on coordinated advances behind overlapping shield walls. Cracked shields compromise formation integrity, while damaged shield grips create control problems that affect your ability to protect both yourself and adjacent warriors. Shield maintenance includes checking leather bindings, wooden framework, and metal reinforcements that determine defensive capabilities. Armor inspection varies according to what protective equipment you can afford or have acquired through previous military success. Leather armor requires checking for tears, stretched bindings, or hardening treatments that maintain flexibility while providing protection. Mail shirts demand examination for broken rings, corrosion, or damage that reduces defensive effectiveness. Helmet condition affects head protection and visibility that influence combat performance. Physical training emphasizes strength, endurance, and combat skills that separate living warriors from decorative corpses. Morning exercises include weapon drills that maintain muscle memory for sword work, spear fighting, and shield manipulation. Wrestling matches develop grappling skills while providing entertainment that strengthens social bonds between warriors who might soon depend on each other for survival. Tactical instruction covers formation fighting, individual combat techniques, and coordination methods that maximize barbarian advantages while minimizing exposure to enemy strengths. Learning to fight in shield walls, execute coordinated charges, and maintain unit cohesion during chaotic battle conditions requires practice that builds both individual skills and group effectiveness. The hunt serves multiple purposes, providing food for tribal consumption, developing tracking and stalking skills applicable to warfare, and offering opportunities for young warriors to demonstrate courage and competence in dangerous situations. Hunting large game requires teamwork, planning, and risk tolerance that translate directly to military applications. Craft work includes maintaining and improving personal equipment while contributing to tribal production that supports warrior society. Metalworking skills enable weapon and tool creation. Leatherworking provides armor and equipment. Woodworking produces shields, spear shafts, and various implements necessary for military effectiveness. Evening activities include storytelling that preserves tribal history and military traditions, drinking that strengthens social bonds while occasionally leading to the kind of disputes that require blood sport resolution, and planning sessions where experienced warriors share tactical knowledge with newer tribal members. The social obligations include participating in assemblies that make decisions affecting tribal welfare, contributing labor to community projects that benefit everyone's survival, and maintaining relationships with kinship groups whose support determines your status within tribal hierarchy. And through it all, you're developing the mindset that separates barbarian warriors from civilized soldiers. Personal honor supersedes institutional loyalty. Individual courage matters more than tactical discipline, and dying gloriously in battle is preferable to living safely in obscurity. Time to discuss your professional wardrobe, and by wardrobe I mean the collection of weapons, armor, and status symbols designed to keep you alive while communicating your prowess to enemies who need to understand exactly how dangerous you are before they make career-ending decisions about challenging your combat effectiveness. Barbarian warrior equipment combines practical functionality with psychological warfare through intimidation displays that affect enemy morale before fighting begins. Your primary weapon determines both combat capabilities and social status within warrior hierarchy. The spear serves as both thrusting weapon for close combat and throwing weapon for ranged engagement, with different spear types indicating specialized roles within tribal military organization. Ash wood shafts provide flexibility and strength, while iron points deliver penetrating power that can breach armor and inflict fatal wounds. Spear length varies according to tactical requirements. Longer spears for formation fighting, shorter spears for individual combat. The sword represents ultimate warrior status because quality blades require expensive materials, skilled craftsmanship, and substantial investment that only successful warriors can afford. Pattern-welded swords display intricate designs that demonstrate both metallurgical sophistication and owner wealth. Sword possession indicates warrior rank, while blade quality reflects combat experience and raiding success. Only proven fighters carry swords because unsuccessful warriors don't survive long enough to acquire expensive weapons. Shield construction utilizes leather-covered wooden frameworks reinforced with metal fittings that provide protection while maintaining maneuverability necessary for active combat. Shield designs include tribal symbols, personal heraldry, and intimidation decorations that identify friendly forces while demoralizing enemies. Shield size balances protection against mobility. Larger shields offer better defense but reduce speed and agility during individual combat. Your helmet represents both head protection and status display through decorative elements that communicate warrior rank and tribal affiliation. Simple leather caps provide basic protection for common fighters, while elaborate metal helmets with horn decorations, face masks, or crest displays indicate elite status. Helmet design must balance protection against visibility and hearing requirements that affect combat effectiveness. Armor availability depends on personal wealth and military success because protective equipment represents significant investment in materials and craftsmanship. Leather armor provides basic protection while remaining affordable for most warriors. Mail shirts offer superior defense but require substantial resources for acquisition. Scale armor combines protection with intimidation through metallic displays that create psychological advantages. The sayak serves as both utility knife and backup weapon for close quarters combat when primary weapons become unavailable. This single-edged blade handles daily tasks while providing emergency fighting capability during desperate situations. Siak's quality indicates owner status, while blade maintenance demonstrates warrior competence in equipment care. Personal decorations include torques, arm rings, and other jewelry that display wealth accumulated through successful raiding while serving as portable currency during economic transactions. Gold and silver ornaments indicate prosperity, while bronze accessories show participation in warrior culture. Jewelry designs often incorporate tribal symbols or protective motifs that provide spiritual benefits alongside material display. Clothing combines practical protection against weather with tribal identity markers that distinguish friendly forces during combat confusion. Woolen cloaks provide warmth and weather protection while displaying clan colors or patterns. Leather garments offer durability and limited protection while allowing freedom of movement necessary for combat effectiveness. The war gear totality creates psychological impact that affects both enemy morale and tribal status. Well-equipped warriors project confidence and capability that influences combat outcomes before weapons clash. Poor equipment indicates lower status, while creating vulnerabilities that enemies exploit during battle encounters. Everything you wear or carry sends messages about your combat experience, raiding success, and tribal position, while providing the tools necessary for survival in a culture where personal violence determines social relationships and material prosperity. The economic foundation of barbarian society operates on principles that combine agricultural production, skilled craftsmanship, and organized military appropriation of resources from neighboring tribes and civilized territories. Your warrior status depends on understanding how tribal wealth generation creates the prosperity necessary to support professional fighters while providing targets for military ventures that justify the warrior lifestyle. Agricultural production forms the base of tribal economy through crop cultivation and animal husbandry that feed populations while generating surpluses for trade and military supply. Grain production provides basic nutrition and brewing materials for the ale that lubricates social relationships and religious ceremonies. Livestock contribute meat, dairy products, leather for equipment, and mobile wealth that can be driven away during emergency evacuations or contributed to military campaigns. Craft specialization creates economic advantages through skilled artisans who produce weapons, tools, and luxury goods that command premium prices in both tribal and international markets. Metalworking generates weapons and agricultural implements while demonstrating technological sophistication that influences tribal reputation. Textile production provides clothing and trade goods while employing tribal members whose skills contribute to overall prosperity. The raid economy supplements agricultural and craft production through organized theft that redistributes wealth from civilized territories to barbarian tribes. Successful raids provide immediate material benefits while demonstrating warrior effectiveness that enhances tribal prestige and individual status. Raiding targets include isolated farmsteads, merchant caravans, and sometimes larger settlements that offer substantial rewards for successful military ventures. Trade relationships extend tribal economic reach through networks that exchange barbarian products for manufactured goods, raw materials, and luxury items unavailable in tribal territories. Amber, furs, and skilled metalwork command high prices in Roman markets, while Roman wine, jewelry, and weapons find eager customers among barbarian elites. Trade creates economic interdependence that influences political relationships. Tribute collection from subordinate tribes or defeated enemies provides regular income streams that support warrior bands while demonstrating political dominance over regional territories. Tribute payments often include agricultural products, craft goods, livestock, and human resources that strengthen the collecting tribe while weakening potential rivals. The honor economy operates alongside material considerations through systems where reputation, glory, and social status create value that influences tribal relationships and individual advancement opportunities. Successful warriors accumulate honor through combat achievements, while generous gift-giving demonstrates prosperity and leadership qualities that affect political influence. Wealth distribution policies maintain social cohesion through traditions that require successful raiders to share spoils with their followers and tribal communities. Generous leaders build loyalty while greedy chiefs create resentment that can escalate into challenges to their authority. Balancing personal accumulation against social obligations requires political skills that complement military capabilities. Labor organization includes free warriors, dependent clients, and slaves whose work generates tribal wealth while maintaining social hierarchies that reflect military and political relationships. Free members contribute labor and military service. Clients provide specialized skills in exchange for protection. Slaves handle basic production tasks that support tribal economy. Currency systems utilize both coined money acquired through trade and traditional value measures based on livestock, weapons, and personal ornaments. Roman coins provide standardized exchange media, while traditional wealth forms maintain cultural significance in tribal transactions. Understanding multiple currency systems becomes necessary for economic success. The war economy converts military success into material prosperity through plunder acquisition, territorial expansion, and enhanced trading relationships that result from demonstrated military capability. Successful warfare generates immediate wealth while creating long-term economic advantages that justify military investment and warrior maintenance. Economic intelligence about neighboring tribes and Roman territories affects raiding planning and diplomatic strategies that determine tribal prosperity. Understanding enemy wealth, defensive capabilities, and economic vulnerabilities allows efficient resource allocation for military ventures that maximize rewards while minimizing risks. And there's always the economic pressure to maintain warrior lifestyle through continued military success, because tribes that stop raiding effectively often find themselves targeted by more aggressive neighbors who view military weakness as economic opportunity. Managing barbarian tribal economics requires balancing immediate consumption against long-term sustainability, while maintaining the military capabilities that protect tribal independence and enable continued wealth accumulation through organized violence. Now comes the ultimate test of your warrior training: actual combat against enemies who've made professional careers out of killing people exactly like you. Barbarian warfare emphasizes personal courage, individual skill, and the kind of ferocious aggression that breaks enemy morale, while creating the glorious deaths that warrior culture celebrates as ultimate achievements. The battle preparation begins with ritual activities that invoke divine protection, while strengthening warrior resolve through ceremonial displays of tribal unity and individual commitment. Pre-battle ceremonies include weapon blessings, ancestor invocations, and oath-taking that binds warriors to fight courageously while promising mutual support during combat. These rituals serve both spiritual and psychological functions that prepare warriors for mortal combat. Formation tactics emphasize the shield wall, coordinated advance behind overlapping shields that provides protection while maintaining offensive capability through spear thrusts and sword work. Success depends on maintaining formation integrity while advancing toward enemy positions that include archers, cavalry, and infantry formations designed to break barbarian charges through superior discipline and tactical coordination. The Berserker phenomenon represents the extreme expression of barbarian warrior culture through fighters who enter trance-like states that eliminate fear while enhancing combat effectiveness. Berserkers fight with supernatural fury that intimidates enemies while inspiring friendly forces, but their uncontrolled aggression can compromise tactical coordination and endanger allied warriors caught in their combat enthusiasm. Individual combat showcases personal skills that determine both immediate survival and long-term reputation within warrior society. Single combat between champions often decides battle outcomes, while providing opportunities for warriors to demonstrate the courage and skill that elevate their status within tribal hierarchy. Personal duels require mastery of weapons, armor, and psychology that separates legendary fighters from common warriors. Psychological warfare utilizes barbarian reputation for ferocity, combined with intimidation displays that demoralize enemies before physical combat begins. War cries, weapon clashing, and ritual challenges create fear that affects enemy performance while building warrior confidence through group solidarity and shared aggression. Siege warfare presents challenges for barbarian forces whose tactical traditions emphasize open-field combat rather than systematic reduction of fortified positions. Attacking defended settlements requires coordination, patience, and engineering skills that complement individual warrior capabilities while maintaining unit cohesion during extended operations. Cavalry tactics integrate horsemen with infantry formations to create combined arms operations that exploit barbarian advantages in mobility and shock action. Mounted warriors provide reconnaissance, harassment, and pursuit capabilities, while supporting infantry advances through coordinated charges that break enemy formations. Night attacks utilize barbarian advantages in local knowledge and individual initiative to strike enemy camps during vulnerable periods when sentries are reduced and coordination is difficult. Successful night operations require stealth, timing, and individual competence that allows small groups to achieve tactical surprise against larger enemy forces. Pursuit operations after successful battles maximize victory benefits through aggressive follow-up that prevents enemy reorganization while capturing prisoners, equipment, and territorial advantages. Effective pursuit requires maintaining unit discipline while exploiting success through coordinated action that destroys defeated enemies rather than allowing their escape. The aftermath management includes casualty care for wounded warriors, distribution of captured spoils according to tribal customs and individual contributions, and celebration of heroic deeds that strengthen warrior culture while honoring fallen comrades who died gloriously in battle. Victory conditions extend beyond immediate battlefield success to include territorial gains, tribute extraction, and enhanced tribal reputation that influences future conflicts while providing economic benefits that justify military investment and warrior maintenance. You're fighting for personal honor, tribal glory, and material gain while facing enemies whose tactical advantages include superior organization, equipment standardization, and strategic coordination that has conquered most of the civilized world through systematic application of military professionalism. Here's the moment where barbarian warrior culture confronts the ultimate challenge, fighting Roman legions whose tactical sophistication, technological advantages, and strategic coordination have created the most successful military machine in ancient history. You're about to discover that individual courage and tribal ferocity don't automatically overcome systematic advantages when fighting enemies who've professionalized warfare. Roman military superiority begins with professional soldiers who train constantly, while barbarian warriors fight seasonally between agricultural responsibilities and tribal obligations. Legionaries develop combat skills through daily drill while maintaining physical conditioning that allows sustained performance during extended campaigns. Roman soldiers are career military professionals. Barbarian warriors are citizen militia with other responsibilities that limit their military focus. The tactical advantages favor Romans whose formation, fighting, coordinated maneuvers, and unit discipline create effectiveness that multiplies individual capabilities through systematic cooperation. Roman centuries advance in coordinated waves that maintain formation integrity, while barbarian charges rely on individual courage and group momentum that dissipates when initial attacks fail to break enemy lines. Equipment standardization gives Romans logistical advantages while ensuring consistent performance across all units, regardless of individual economic status. Every Roman soldier carries similar weapons and armor that provide predictable capabilities, while barbarian equipment varies according to personal wealth and individual preferences. Standardization enables tactical coordination while creating supply advantages. Engineering capabilities allow Romans to modify terrain, construct fortifications, and build infrastructure that creates strategic advantages unavailable to barbarian forces. Roman armies carry tools and expertise that transform landscape features into tactical assets, while barbarian forces must accept terrain conditions as unchangeable factors affecting battle outcomes. The intelligence networks provide Romans with information about barbarian tribal politics, military capabilities, and internal conflicts that enable divide and conquer strategies. Roman commanders understand barbarian weaknesses better than many barbarians understand Roman capabilities, creating asymmetric advantages that affect strategic planning and tactical execution. Logistical superiority enables Romans to maintain operational tempo across multiple seasons, while barbarian forces face resource constraints that limit campaign duration and military effectiveness. Roman supply systems support extended operations while barbarian armies must return home for agricultural responsibilities that affect military sustainability. Coordinated strategy allows Romans to conduct simultaneous operations across multiple theaters while maintaining communication and mutual support between widely separated forces. Barbarian tribes operate independently without strategic coordination that might create advantages through synchronized resistance or resource sharing. Economic sustainability gives Romans unlimited time to achieve objectives, while barbarian resistance faces resource depletion that affects long-term military viability. Roman wealth generates military advantages that compound over time, while barbarian resources diminish through continued resistance and Roman economic warfare. Political unity among Romans contrasts with barbarian tribal divisions that prevent effective coordination despite shared interests in opposing Roman expansion. Roman commanders face unified enemies, while barbarian chiefs must consider tribal rivalries that affect alliance possibilities and strategic planning. The psychological factors include Roman confidence, based on previous victories against similar enemies, while barbarian morale faces the challenge of fighting enemies whose reputation for invincibility creates doubt about resistance effectiveness. Roman success breeds more success, while barbarian failures compound into defeatism. Cultural adaptability allows Romans to incorporate effective barbarian tactics while maintaining systematic advantages that barbarian forces cannot easily counter. Romans learn from enemies while preserving organizational superiority that enables tactical innovation without compromising strategic effectiveness. Your warrior culture emphasizes individual glory and personal honor, while Roman military culture prioritizes unit effectiveness and collective success. The fundamental philosophical differences create tactical mismatches where barbarian strengths become Roman opportunities and barbarian traditions become Roman advantages. Even successful barbarian resistance only delays Roman expansion rather than preventing it, because Roman resources and systematic advantages exceed barbarian capabilities by margins that individual courage cannot overcome. Time for absolute honesty about your survival prospects as a barbarian tribal warrior facing the combined challenges of intertribal warfare and Roman imperial expansion. Modern people thrust into this historical reality would discover that warrior culture requires physical conditioning, psychological preparation, and cultural knowledge that contemporary life simply doesn't provide. Your soft modern physique would collapse under the physical demands of barbarian warrior training before enemies could finish the job through combat. You're accustomed to climate control, ergonomic tools, and safety regulations that prevent physical deterioration through occupational hazards. Ancient warrior life involved daily weapons training, manual labor, and living conditions that built the strength and endurance necessary for survival in violent societies. The psychological adjustment would destroy your mental health through exposure to routine violence, constant danger, and moral frameworks that celebrate killing as personal achievement. You've been raised with concepts like conflict resolution, legal protection, and therapeutic intervention that didn't exist in cultures where personal disputes were settled through trial by combat and social advancement required successful violence against human opponents. The combat skills necessary for warrior survival take decades to develop through training that begins in childhood and continues through lifelong practice with edged weapons. Modern people lack experience with swords, spears, and other implements whose primary function involves penetrating human flesh while avoiding similar treatment from opponents who've been practicing lethal techniques since they could walk. The cultural knowledge required for tribal integration includes understanding kinship networks, honor codes, and social expectations that determined everything from marriage eligibility to military obligations. Making mistakes about tribal customs creates internal conflicts that could result in expulsion, enslavement, or death through violation of sacred traditions that governed barbarian society. The economic understanding necessary for tribal survival involves agricultural cycles, craft production, and raiding strategies that provided the wealth necessary to support warrior lifestyle. Poor economic decisions affect tribal prosperity while creating vulnerabilities that enemies exploit for strategic advantage during military campaigns or diplomatic negotiations. The linguistic barriers would prevent effective communication with tribal members who spoke Germanic languages without modern translation services or educational systems. Warrior culture required inspiring speeches, tactical coordination, and social interaction that depended on language skills you don't possess and cultural references you don't understand. The spiritual obligations include sincere participation in religious practices that provided psychological support while legitimizing social hierarchies and military activities. Ancient warrior cultures integrated religious beliefs with military functions in ways that modern skepticism makes difficult to embrace authentically. The technological limitations would doom you through lack of modern medical care, communication systems, and safety equipment that make contemporary dangerous occupations survivable. Ancient warriors faced combat injuries, disease outbreaks, and environmental hazards without antibiotics, emergency services, or protective equipment that modern military personnel consider essential. The social pressures would overwhelm your individualistic modern sensibilities through constant demands for group loyalty, personal sacrifice, and conformity to cultural standards that prioritize tribal welfare over individual preferences. Barbarian society operated on collective principles that required subordinating personal desires to community needs. Your survival would depend entirely on luck. The luck of avoiding combat, escaping disease, preventing accidents, and somehow acquiring the skills necessary for warrior culture without making fatal mistakes during the learning process. But luck runs out eventually, and barbarian life was designed to eliminate incompetent members through natural selection processes that favored only the strongest and most adaptable individuals. Even if you somehow survived the initial adjustment period, the long-term prospects remain uniformly fatal because warrior culture had 100% mortality rates for participants who continued fighting until old age. Ancient warriors either died young in combat or transitioned to non-combat roles that didn't require physical confrontation with armed opponents. So no, you wouldn't last a day as a barbarian tribal warrior. You'd probably die during your first weapons training session, definitely die during your first raid or battle, and almost certainly die in ways that would seem completely preventable to anyone with modern safety knowledge and medical care. But hey, you'd die as part of one of history's most legendary warrior traditions. That's got to count for something when explaining your career choices to whatever gods handle occupational casualties involving really sharp metal objects, right? Actually, probably not. But at least your death would be historically significant for researchers studying ancient warrior cultures and the occupational hazards of professional violence in societies where dying gloriously in battle was considered the ultimate career achievement. Welcome to barbarian tribal society, where individual courage was celebrated, tribal loyalty was essential, and the difference between heroic legend and decorative skull was usually measured in how effectively you could swing sharp objects, while avoiding having sharp objects swung at you by people who'd been practicing longer. Picture this. You're living in ancient Egypt around 1370 BCE, and somewhere in the kingdom, a girl is being born who will become one of history's most famous queens, spark the ancient world's first religious revolution, and leave behind the most iconic sculpture of a woman ever created. The only problem? We have absolutely no idea who her parents were, where she came from, or how she ended up married to the most radical pharaoh in Egyptian history. Welcome to the enigma that is Nefertiti, whose very name means the beautiful one has come, and who apparently came from somewhere, maybe. The ancient Egyptians, who were normally obsessed with recording every detail of royal lineages, suddenly developed selective amnesia when it came to documenting Nefertiti's background. It's like finding a superstar actress in Hollywood who nobody remembers auditioning. What we do know is that by her teenage years, Nefertiti was living in the Egyptian royal court and was presumably important enough to catch the attention of Prince Amenhotep IV, the heir to the throne who would later become the pharaoh we know as Akhenaten. This suggests she was either from a noble family wealthy enough to place their daughter in the royal household, or she was already connected to the royal family in some way that the official records decided to forget. Some scholars think she might have been the daughter of Ay, a powerful courtier who would later become pharaoh himself. Others suggest she could have been a foreign princess sent to Egypt as part of a diplomatic marriage alliance. A few even propose that she might have been Akhenaten's sister or half-sister, because the Egyptian royal family had a long-standing tradition of keeping things in the family, often literally. The mystery of her origins becomes even more intriguing when you consider that Nefertiti would go on to become one of the most powerful queens in Egyptian history, co-ruling an empire that stretched from Sudan to Syria. You don't usually hand that kind of authority to someone whose resume reads, appeared mysteriously in the palace as a teenager. What's clear is that whoever Nefertiti was and wherever she came from, she possessed the kind of intelligence, charisma, and political savvy that would allow her to become not just a queen, but a partner in the most radical transformation Egypt had seen since the pyramids were built. She was about to help her husband challenge 100 years of Egyptian religious tradition, move the capital to a city that didn't exist yet, and generally behaved like they thought being pharaoh meant you could rewrite the fundamental assumptions of an entire civilization. They were right, as it turned out. They could do exactly that. Whether it was a good idea was an entirely different question. Somewhere in the opulent halls of the Egyptian royal palace at Thebes, teenage Nefertiti encountered Prince Amenhotep IV, and their meeting would eventually trigger the ancient world's first documented religious revolution. This wasn't just a case of young love blooming in a royal garden. It was the beginning of a partnership that would challenge every fundamental assumption about Egyptian religion, politics, and divine authority. Prince Amenhotep IV was not your typical heir to the throne. While most Egyptian princes were busy learning conventional pharaoh skills like military strategy, diplomatic protocol, and how to look appropriately divine while wearing a ceremonial beard, Amenhotep was developing some very unconventional ideas about religion, art, and the nature of royal authority. He was essentially preparing to become the world's first monotheistic revolutionary, which was about as popular with the Egyptian establishment as suggesting they replace the pyramids with modern condominiums. The attraction between Nefertiti and Amenhotep seems to have been both personal and intellectual. Ancient Egyptian art from their early years shows them in remarkably intimate poses for royal portraits, touching each other, sharing private moments, and generally behaving like they actually enjoyed each other's company rather than just fulfilling dynastic obligations. This was unusual enough in royal marriages to suggest genuine affection. More importantly, Nefertiti appears to have shared, or at least supported, Amenhotep's radical religious ideas. This wasn't a case of a dutiful wife going along with her husband's hobbies. She would become an active participant in transforming Egyptian religion from a complex polytheistic system centered on the god Amun into a monotheistic faith focused on a single solar deity called the Aten. Their marriage, which probably took place around 1353 BCE, marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary partnerships in ancient history. Within a few years, they would change their names. Amenhotep became Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, move the capital from Thebes to a completely new city they built from scratch, and launch an artistic and cultural revolution that rejected 100 years of Egyptian traditions. For Nefertiti, marrying Amenhotep meant signing up for the ancient equivalent of a startup that planned to disrupt the religion industry. She was betting her future on a man whose business plan involved convincing an entire civilization to abandon the gods their ancestors had worshipped since before the pyramids were built. It was either the most romantic partnership in ancient history, two young idealists determined to transform the world together, or the most catastrophic case of mutual delusion ever recorded, possibly both. What's certain is that Nefertiti was about to become far more than just another Egyptian queen. She was going to be co-founder of a religious movement, co-architect of a new capital city, and co-star in an artistic revolution that would influence Egyptian culture for generations. The mysterious girl who had appeared in the royal court was about to help reshape one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations. Unfortunately, revolutions are easier to start than to control, and neither Nefertiti nor her husband had much experience with the practical difficulties of convincing an entire empire to adopt a completely new way of thinking about the universe. In 1353 BCE, Amenhotep IV became pharaoh of Egypt and promptly announced that he had some very exciting new ideas about religion that everyone was definitely going to love. Spoiler alert, they didn't. What followed was the ancient world's first experiment in monotheism, led by a pharaoh who apparently thought that 1,500 years of religious tradition were just suggestions that could be improved upon. Nefertiti found herself at the center of this theological revolution, which was like being asked to help renovate a house, only to discover that your husband's renovation plan involved demolishing the foundation and rebuilding everything according to a blueprint he'd sketched on the back of a napkin. The traditional Egyptian pantheon was a crowded affair featuring hundreds of gods and goddesses, each with their own temples, priests, festivals, and very lucrative religious bureaucracies. At the top of this divine hierarchy sat Amun-Ra, the king of the gods, whose priesthood had become so wealthy and powerful that they were essentially running a parallel government. Pharaohs were supposed to be divine, but the priests of Amun were the ones who confirmed divine authority, which gave them uncomfortable amounts of leverage over royal policy. Akhenaten's solution was elegantly radical. Eliminate all the other gods and replace them with a single deity, the Aten. represented as a solar disk whose rays ended in hands that bestowed life and prosperity directly on the royal family. It was like creating a spiritual monopoly where the pharaoh served as the exclusive distributor of divine favor, cutting out all the middlemen who had been complicating royal authority for centuries. Nefertiti wasn't just a passive observer of this religious restructuring, she became its co-architect and primary promoter. In the art and inscriptions from their reign, she appears alongside Akhenaten in religious ceremonies, receiving the Atene's blessing and participating in rituals that previous queens had never been allowed to perform. She was essentially being promoted from royal spouse to religious co-leader, which was either extremely progressive or completely heretical, depending on your perspective. The couple changed their names to reflect their new religious commitment. Amenhotep, Amun is satisfied, became Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, while Nefertiti kept her name but added new titles that emphasized her role as the Atene's beloved. They were rebranding themselves as the prophets of a new religious movement that promised to simplify Egyptian spirituality while conveniently centralizing all religious authority in the royal palace. From a political standpoint, the Aten revolution was brilliant. By eliminating the traditional priesthood, Akhenaten and Nefertiti were removing the main institutional check on pharaonic power. Instead of having to negotiate with powerful religious authorities, they could rule as direct representatives of the only god that mattered. From a practical standpoint, the revolution was catastrophically naive. They were asking an entire civilization to abandon religious practices that had been part of Egyptian identity since before anyone could remember, replacing familiar local gods with an abstract solar deity that most people couldn't relate to or understand. But Nefertiti and Akhenaten were young, idealistic, and absolutely convinced that they were pioneering a more enlightened form of spirituality that would bring peace, prosperity, and divine favor to Egypt. They were about to discover that convincing people to change their fundamental beliefs about the universe was significantly more difficult than they had anticipated. If you're going to revolutionize an entire civilization's religious beliefs, you probably need a new capital city that reflects your radical vision. At least, that was the logic behind Akhenaten and Nefertiti's decision to abandon Thebes, with its inconvenient concentration of traditional temples and stubborn priests, and build a completely new city dedicated to their solar deity. The site they chose was a stretch of desert on the east bank of the Nile, roughly halfway between Memphis and Thebes, that had the advantage of being completely uninhabited. This meant they could design their ideal city from scratch without having to work around existing temples, neighborhoods, or people who might have opinions about the new religious program. They called their new capital Akhetaten, meaning horizon of the Aten, which was either beautifully poetic or pretentiously grandiose, depending on your tolerance for royal branding exercises. The city was designed as a physical manifestation of their religious revolution, with temples open to the sky so the Aten's rays could illuminate the worship services, and palaces positioned to maximize the royal family's exposure to their solar deity. Nefertiti played a central role in Amarna's development, appearing in numerous reliefs and inscriptions that show her participating in religious ceremonies, reviewing architectural plans, and generally behaving like someone who was co-managing the construction of a new capital. This was unprecedented for an Egyptian queen, who were typically confined to ceremonial roles and domestic management. The speed of construction was remarkable. Within a few years, they had created a functioning city, complete with royal palaces, administrative buildings, workshops, and residential districts for the thousands of officials, artisans, and workers who were relocating to support the new capital. It was like building Washington, D.C. from scratch, except with more sand and fewer constitutional conventions. The architectural style of Amarna reflected the broader artistic revolution that accompanied the religious changes. Traditional Egyptian art had been rigidly formal for centuries, with strict conventions governing how pharaohs, gods, and ordinary people could be depicted. Amarna art was startlingly naturalistic, showing the royal family in intimate domestic scenes that would have been unthinkable in traditional Egyptian representation. Nefertiti appears in many of these informal artistic representations, playing with her daughters, embracing her husband, and generally being depicted as a real person, rather than a divine statue. The famous bust of Nefertiti that sits in Berlin's Egyptian Museum today comes from this period and exemplifies the new artistic style. Beautiful, realistic, and utterly unlike anything in previous Egyptian art. But building a new capital city is expensive, and funding Amarna required resources that might have been better spent on maintaining Egypt's borders, managing the economy, or keeping the traditional religious establishment from plotting rebellion. The project was absorbing enormous amounts of wealth and attention, while potential problems accumulated in other parts of the empire. For Nefertiti and Akhenaten, Amarna represented the physical realization of their vision for a reformed Egypt. For everyone else in the kingdom, it probably looked like an extremely expensive experiment in royal self-indulgence that was being funded by their taxes, while foreign enemies tested Egypt's military defenses. The city would thrive for about 2 decades before being abandoned, but during its brief existence, Amarna served as the center of one of the most radical experiments in ancient history. Whether that experiment was visionary or delusional would depend on whether you were living inside the beautiful new city or paying for its construction from somewhere else in the empire. By the middle of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti had accumulated a level of political and religious authority that was unprecedented for an Egyptian queen. She wasn't just supporting her husband's policies, she was actively creating and implementing them, appearing in official art and inscriptions as a co-ruler rather than a ceremonial spouse. In traditional Egyptian iconography, queens appeared behind their husbands or in subordinate positions that emphasized their secondary status. Nefertiti appears alongside Akhenaten as an equal partner, sometimes even in dominant positions that suggest she wielded independent authority. This was like seeing a modern corporate executive whose business cards read co-CEO when the traditional title would have been CEO's wife. The religious authority that Nefertiti exercised was particularly revolutionary. In traditional Egyptian religion, pharaohs served as intermediaries between the gods and the people, but this role was exclusively male. Nefertiti appears in Amarna art performing religious ceremonies independently, receiving divine blessings directly from the Aten, and participating in rituals that previous queens had been forbidden to conduct. Some inscriptions from Amarna suggest that Nefertiti may have been considered a pharaoh in her own right, ruling alongside Akhenaten as a co-monarch, rather than serving as his queen. This interpretation is controversial among Egyptologists, but the artistic and textual evidence suggests that she wielded real political power, rather than just the ceremonial influence. Her role in governing the empire seems to have been substantial. Foreign diplomatic correspondence from the Amarna period includes letters addressed to Nefertiti directly, suggesting that international leaders understood she was a decision-maker rather than just a figurehead. This was extraordinary in the ancient world, where women rarely participated in foreign policy except as diplomatic marriage partners. Nefertiti also appears to have been heavily involved in managing the construction of Amarna and the implementation of the religious reforms. Inscriptions show her supervising temple construction, overseeing artistic projects, and participating in administrative decisions that affected the entire kingdom. She was functioning as something between a queen, a prime minister, and a religious leader. The couple's 6 daughters were also incorporated into the new religious and political system in ways that emphasized the royal family's unique relationship with the Aten. Unlike traditional Egyptian royal children, who were rarely depicted in official art, Nefertiti's daughters appear frequently in Amarna reliefs, participating in religious ceremonies and demonstrating the divine favor that blessed the royal family. This elevation of the nuclear family to central importance in Egyptian religion and politics was another radical departure from tradition. Previous pharaohs had emphasized their connections to ancient divine lineages and established religious authorities. Akhenaten and Nefertiti were essentially arguing that their personal family was more important than thousands of years of Egyptian religious tradition. For Nefertiti, this represented an unprecedented expansion of female political and religious authority. She had transformed herself from a queen consort into something approaching a co-pharaoh, wielding power that no Egyptian woman before her had ever exercised. Whether this power was sustainable in a civilization that had never accepted female rule as legitimate was another question entirely. Nefertiti was conducting a massive experiment in gender roles and political authority, and the results would determine whether her innovations outlasted her personal influence. Nefertiti and Akhenaten didn't just revolutionize Egyptian religion and politics, they also transformed the royal family into a kind of divine reality show starring themselves and their 6 daughters in an ongoing demonstration of how the Aten's blessings manifested in the royal household. It was like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, except with more religious significance and considerably higher stakes. Their daughters, Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankasenamun, Neferneferuaten Tasharit, Neferneferure, and Setepenre, weren't just royal children. They were living proof of divine favour and key players in the new religious drama that their parents were staging for the entire Egyptian empire. Each birth was celebrated as confirmation that the Aten approved of the royal couple's religious revolution. Unlike traditional Egyptian royal children, who were typically kept out of public view until they were old enough for political marriages or administrative roles, Nefertiti's daughters appeared constantly in Amarna art and public ceremonies. They were shown playing at their parents' feet during religious rituals, accompanying the royal couple on state occasions, and generally demonstrating that the royal family enjoyed a special relationship with their solar deity. This public prominence of the royal daughters served multiple political and religious purposes. It humanized the pharaoh and queen, showing them as loving parents rather than distant divine figures. It demonstrated the fertility and divine blessing that the Aten had bestowed on the royal family. And it provided living symbols of the new religious order that was replacing traditional Egyptian practices. The artistic representation of the royal family during this period was revolutionary in its intimacy and naturalism. Previous Egyptian royal art had been formal and ceremonial, showing pharaohs in idealized poses that emphasized their divine nature. Amarna art showed Nefertiti and Akhenaten kissing their daughters, playing with them, and engaging in the kind of domestic activities that had never been considered appropriate subjects for royal monuments. Unfortunately, the royal family's domestic happiness was shadowed by tragedy. At least 2 of Nefertiti's daughters died during childhood, probably from plague or other diseases that periodically swept through ancient cities. These deaths were devastating personally, but also posed political and religious challenges, since they suggested that even the royal family wasn't immune to the kind of suffering that the Aten revolution was supposed to eliminate. The surviving daughters would play crucial roles in the transition period after Akhenaten's death. Ankhesenamun became the wife of Tutankhamun, linking the old religious revolution to the new restoration. Meritaten may have served briefly as pharaoh after her father's death, continuing the tradition of female authority that her mother had established. The prominence of Nefertiti's daughters in Amarna religious and political life represented another way that she was transforming traditional Egyptian practices. By making her children central figures in the new religious system, she was arguing that royal authority flowed through family relationships rather than just through male inheritance patterns. It was a beautiful vision of royal family life that emphasized love, intimacy, and shared religious devotion. Whether it was sustainable in the harsh realities of ancient political life was another question entirely. Around year 14 of Akhenaten's reign, something extraordinary happened. Nefertiti vanished from the historical record as completely as if she had been erased by divine intervention. One day she was appearing in royal inscriptions and religious ceremonies as co-ruler of Egypt. The next day she was gone, leaving behind one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries and enough theories to fuel academic conferences for the next century. The disappearance wasn't gradual. It was like someone had taken an eraser to Egyptian history and systematically removed every trace of her existence. Monuments that had featured her prominently were altered to show Akhenaten alone or with other family members. New inscriptions made no mention of her. Art that had celebrated her as co-ruler of Egypt suddenly acted as if she had never existed. This systematic erasure was so thorough that it suggests deliberate policy rather than natural death or retirement. When Egyptian queens died of natural causes, they typically received elaborate burials and continued to be honoured in royal inscriptions. When they fell from favour, they were usually exiled or relegated to minor roles rather than being completely eliminated from official records. Several theories attempt to explain Nefertiti's disappearance, and none of them are particularly comforting. The first possibility is that she died suddenly, perhaps from plague or accident, and was buried quickly without the usual royal ceremonies. This would explain her absence from later records, but doesn't account for the systematic removal of her image from existing monuments. A more intriguing theory suggests that Nefertiti didn't disappear at all, but instead transformed herself into the mysterious pharaoh known as Neferneferuaten who appears briefly in Egyptian records after Akhenaten's death. This would mean that she successfully transitioned from queen to ruling pharaoh in her own right, becoming one of the few women in Egyptian history to claim independent royal authority. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial but compelling. Neferuaten appears in inscriptions during the chaotic period immediately following Akhenaten's death and seems to have attempted to restore traditional Egyptian religion while maintaining some elements of the Aten revolution. This would be exactly the kind of compromise policy that a politically experienced figure like Nefertiti might have pursued. If Nefertiti did become Neferuaten, her reign would have lasted approximately 3 years before she was overthrown by the forces that brought Tutankhamun to power and restored traditional Egyptian religion. Her defeat would have been followed by the same kind of systematic erasure that affected all supporters of the Amarna revolution. A third possibility is that Nefertiti fell from grace due to disagreements with Akhenaten about the direction of their religious revolution. Perhaps she began advocating for compromises with traditional religious authorities, or maybe she opposed specific policies that were damaging Egypt's international position. If so, her removal from power could have been ordered by her own husband as part of his increasingly radical approach to religious reform. Whatever happened to Nefertiti, her disappearance marked the beginning of the end for the Amarna revolution. Without her political skills and religious authority, Akhenaten's increasingly isolated regime began to unravel, setting the stage for the counter-revolution that would restore traditional Egyptian practices and erase most traces of their extraordinary experiment in monotheism. The mystery of her fate has only enhanced Nefertiti's historical reputation, transforming her from a documented historical figure into an enigmatic legend that continues to fascinate scholars and the general public more than 3,000 years later. While Nefertiti and Akhenaten were busy perfecting their religious utopia in Amarna, the rest of Egypt was experiencing the kind of problems that typically arise when you ask an entire civilization to abandon everything they believe about the universe without providing practical alternatives. By the later years of Akhenaten's reign, the Aten revolution was facing a reality check that would make a stock market crash look gentle. The traditional Egyptian priesthood, whose temples had been closed and whose income had been eliminated, were understandably unhappy about the new religious arrangements. These weren't just spiritual leaders, they were administrators of vast economic enterprises that employed thousands of people and provided social services that the royal government had never bothered to replace. Shutting down the temples was like closing hospitals, schools, and social welfare offices simultaneously while expecting people to be grateful for the theological improvement. Local communities throughout Egypt were struggling with the practical implications of religious revolution. Festivals that had organized the agricultural calendar for centuries were banned. Local gods who had protected villages and regions for millennia were declared non-existent. Traditional burial practices that families had followed for generations were suddenly heretical. It was like being told that Christmas, Easter, and every local holiday were now illegal, and you should be happy about it because the new system was more theologically correct. Meanwhile, Egypt's international position was deteriorating rapidly. Foreign enemies were testing the empire's borders while Akhenaten focused on religious reforms rather than military defense. Traditional allies were questioning Egypt's reliability under its radical new leadership. Diplomatic correspondence from the period shows neighboring powers treating Egypt as politically unstable and potentially unreliable as a strategic partner. The economic costs of maintaining Amarna and funding the religious revolution were also becoming apparent. Building and operating a new capital city while simultaneously reorganizing the entire religious infrastructure of an empire was financially ruinous. Resources that should have been invested in maintaining Egypt's military strength and economic competitiveness were being absorbed by what increasingly looked like an expensive exercise in royal self-indulgence. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence discovered by archaeologists, reveal the growing international isolation that Egypt was experiencing. Foreign rulers were complaining that Egyptian military support was unreliable, trade relationships were being disrupted, and the traditional diplomatic protocols that had maintained regional stability were being ignored in favor of religious priorities. By the end of Akhenaten's reign, even supporters of the Aten revolution were beginning to advocate for practical compromises that might save some of their reforms while addressing the empire's immediate crises. The beautiful religious vision that Nefertiti and Akhenaten had created was colliding with the harsh realities of governing an ancient empire in a competitive international environment. The counter-revolution that followed Akhenaten's death wasn't just a religious restoration, it was a comprehensive rejection of everything the Amarna period had represented. Traditional Egyptian religion was restored not because it was necessarily superior to monotheism, but because it worked better as a foundation for political stability and international relations. For Nefertiti, if she lived to see this counter-revolution, it must have been devastating to watch everything she had worked to achieve being systematically dismantled by people who were more concerned with practical governance than with religious innovation. Her life's work was being undone not by superior ideas, but by superior political organization and military force. When the dust settled from the Amarna revolution, Egypt found itself ruled by a 9-year-old pharaoh whose main qualification for the job was that he hadn't been involved in the religious disaster that had nearly bankrupted the empire. Tutankhamun's reign represented the ultimate historical irony. The most famous pharaoh in modern times was essentially hired to be the cleanup crew for one of ancient Egypt's greatest failures. Young Tutankhamun, originally named Tutankhaten before his advisors decided that honoring the Aten was no longer politically viable, faced the enormous task of restoring Egyptian credibility both domestically and internationally. His government, led by experienced officials like Ay and Horemheb, understood that their primary mission was damage control on an epic scale. The restoration of traditional Egyptian religion began immediately and was remarkably thorough. Tutankhamun's early edicts described the chaos that the Aten revolution had created. Temples were ruins, religious festivals had been abandoned, and the gods had turned away from Egypt in anger. Whether or not this was entirely accurate, it provided convenient justification for completely reversing Akhenaten's policies. Amarna was abandoned as the capital, and the royal court returned to Memphis and Thebes, where traditional religious and political institutions were eager to resume their customary roles. The beautiful city that Nefertiti and Akhenaten had built to showcase their religious revolution became a ghost town, gradually covered by sand and forgotten until modern archaeologists rediscovered it. The systematic erasure of the Amarna period from Egyptian historical records was probably motivated by practical political considerations rather than personal vindictiveness. Admitting that recent pharaohs had been catastrophically wrong about fundamental religious questions would have undermined the theoretical foundation of Egyptian monarchy, which depended on the assumption that pharaohs were divinely guided and therefore incapable of major errors. For the ordinary people of Egypt, Tutankhamun's restoration probably came as a relief. They could return to worshipping familiar gods in traditional ways, participate in religious festivals they actually understood, and generally resume living in a civilization that made sense according to their cultural expectations. The exotic appeal of monotheism was considerably diminished when it came packaged with economic hardship and international isolation. But the restoration also represented the complete failure of Nefertiti's vision for transforming Egyptian civilization. Everything she had worked to achieve, religious reform, artistic innovation, expanded female authority, and a new kind of royal family, was systematically eliminated by Tutankhamun's government. The irony is that Tutankhamun, whose reign represented the total repudiation of everything Nefertiti had accomplished, became the most famous Egyptian pharaoh in modern times due to the accidental preservation of his tomb. Meanwhile, Nefertiti, who had wielded far more actual power and historical influence, is remembered primarily for her artistic representations rather than her political achievements. Tutankhamun's early death at approximately 18 years old meant that the restoration was completed by his successors, Ay and Horemheb, who were even more thorough in eliminating traces of the Amarna period. By the time they finished their work, the religious revolution that had dominated Egyptian politics for 2 decades had been so completely erased that later Egyptian historians were unaware it had ever occurred. The boy king who had cleaned up after the Amarna revolution would be forgotten until British archaeologist Howard Carter discovered his intact tomb in 1922, making him more famous in death than he had ever been in life. Sometimes historical reputation has very little to do with historical significance. For over 3,000 years, Nefertiti existed primarily as a name in damaged inscriptions and a few surviving artistic fragments that most scholars couldn't properly interpret. The systematic erasure of the Amarna period from Egyptian records had been so thorough that until the late 19th century, most people had no idea that Egypt's most famous queen had ever lived. Then modern archaeology began uncovering Amarna, and suddenly Nefertiti emerged from historical obscurity to become one of the most recognizable figures from the ancient world. The rediscovery began in the 1880s when local farmers near the modern village of Tel El Amarna started finding ancient artifacts while working their fields. These chance discoveries led to systematic archaeological excavations that revealed the remains of Akhenaten's capital city, complete with palaces, temples, workshops, and residential districts that had been perfectly preserved under desert sand. The most spectacular discovery came on December 6, 1912, when German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt was excavating the workshop of Thutmose, the chief sculptor of Amarna. In a storage room filled with plaster models and unfinished sculptures, his team uncovered what would become the most famous portrait of an ancient woman ever created, the painted limestone bust of Nefertiti that now resides in Berlin's Neues Museum. The bust was so perfectly preserved and so remarkably beautiful that Borchardt initially suspected it might be a modern fake. The painted limestone sculpture showed Nefertiti wearing her distinctive tall blue crown, with elegant features and an expression of serene confidence that seemed to transcend the 3,400 years since its creation. It was like finding a high-definition photograph of someone from ancient history. The discovery immediately created international controversy that continues today. Egypt demanded the return of the bust, arguing that it had been illegally exported during the colonial period when European archaeologists operated under different ethical standards. Germany maintained that the sculpture had been acquired legally according to the agreements in place at the time, and was properly housed in a museum where it could be studied and appreciated by scholars and the public. The diplomatic dispute over Nefertiti's bust has made it one of the most politically controversial artworks in the world, with Egyptian officials regularly demanding its return, and German museum directors just as regularly refusing to consider repatriation. The argument has involved everyone from museum curators to government ministers to international legal experts, turning an ancient Egyptian queen into a modern symbol of cultural property disputes. Meanwhile, ongoing excavations at Amarna have revealed extraordinary details about daily life during the Aten Revolution. Archaeologists have found diplomatic correspondence written on clay tablets, administrative records detailing the city's construction, artistic workshops that produce the revolutionary naturalistic style associated with the Amarna period, and residential areas that show how ordinary people lived in Akhenaten's capital. These discoveries have transformed our understanding of Nefertiti from a mysterious figure mentioned in damaged inscriptions into a complex historical personality whose political and religious influence can be documented through material evidence. We can now see the palaces where she lived, the temples where she worshipped, and even the workshops where artists created her portraits. The famous bust has travelled around the world for exhibitions, drawing millions of visitors who come to see the face of ancient Egypt's most enigmatic queen. Museum attendance spikes wherever Nefertiti appears, demonstrating that her appeal transcends academic interest to touch something deeper in human imagination about beauty, power, and mystery. But the archaeological rediscovery of Nefertiti has raised as many questions as it has answered. The more we learn about her reign, the more complex and contradictory she becomes, challenging simple interpretations of her role and significance while confirming that she was far more important than traditional Egyptian sources had suggested. The quest to find Nefertiti's tomb has become the holy grail of Egyptology, combining cutting-edge technology, international diplomacy, and old-fashioned treasure hunting in pursuit of what could be the most significant archaeological discovery since Tutankhamun's burial chamber. For over a century, archaeologists have been searching for the final resting place of Egypt's most enigmatic queen, driven by the tantalizing possibility that her intact tomb could finally resolve the mysteries surrounding her life, reign, and disappearance. The search has been complicated by the fundamental problem that nobody knows where to look. Unlike other Egyptian royalty, whose burial sites are documented in ancient records or can be inferred from historical evidence, Nefertiti's tomb location was apparently kept secret or lost during the chaos that followed the collapse of the Amarna period. Traditional archaeological searches have focused on three main areas: the Valley of the Kings near Thebes, where most New Kingdom pharaohs were buried; the royal cemetery at Amarna, where Akhenaten and other members of the royal family were interred; and various other sites associated with the Aten Revolution. Despite decades of excavation, these efforts have been largely unsuccessful, though they have yielded valuable information about burial practices during the Amarna period. The most exciting recent theory, proposed by British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves, suggests that Nefertiti might be buried in a hidden chamber connected to Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. This hypothesis is based on high-resolution analysis of the walls in Tutankhamun's burial chamber, which appear to show concealed doorways that could lead to additional rooms. If Reeves is correct, it would mean that Nefertiti was buried with the honours appropriate for a pharaoh rather than a queen, supporting theories that she ruled Egypt independently after Akhenaten's death. The proximity to Tutankhamun's tomb would also suggest that she maintained her royal status during the Restoration period, rather than being eliminated along with other supporters of the Aten Revolution. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies have been used to search for void spaces that might indicate hidden burial chambers. These investigations have identified several promising anomalies, but follow-up excavations have yet to confirm the presence of undiscovered tombs. The Egyptian government has had to balance archaeological enthusiasm with practical concerns about protecting existing sites and managing tourism expectations. Allowing extensive excavations in the Valley of the Kings risks damaging known tombs, while the publicity surrounding Nefertiti searches has created unrealistic public expectations about the likelihood of major discoveries. Recent expeditions have employed increasingly sophisticated technology, including thermal imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and even cosmic ray detection to search for hidden chambers without damaging existing monuments. These non-invasive techniques have revolutionized archaeological exploration, allowing researchers to investigate potential tomb sites without the risks associated with traditional excavation. The search for Nefertiti's tomb has captured public imagination in ways that extend far beyond academic archaeology. The possibility of discovering an intact royal burial from the Amarna period, complete with treasures, artwork, and potentially even preserved organic materials, represents the kind of find that could rewrite textbooks and generate headlines around the world. However, the search has also been marked by false alarms, overhyped theories, and the kind of media circus that often accompanies high-profile archaeological projects. Several expeditions have claimed to be on the verge of major discoveries, only to find empty chambers, natural geological formations, or evidence of ancient tomb robbing rather than intact royal burials. The quest itself has become part of Nefertiti's modern legacy, demonstrating how historical figures can continue to influence contemporary culture long after their deaths. Whether her tomb is ever discovered or remains lost forever, the search for Nefertiti has inspired new archaeological techniques, international collaborations, and public interest in ancient Egyptian civilization. Despite decades of searching and millions of dollars in research funding, Nefertiti's final resting place remains undiscovered. She continues to guard her secrets as effectively in death as she wielded power in life, maintaining the mystery that has made her one of history's most compelling figures. The 1912 discovery of Nefertiti's bust created more than just archaeological excitement. It launched the transformation of an ancient Egyptian queen into a modern global icon whose image has become synonymous with timeless beauty, mysterious femininity, and the romantic appeal of ancient Egypt. Within decades of its discovery, her distinctive profile had become one of the most recognizable images in human history. The timing of the discovery was perfect for creating a cultural phenomenon. The early 20th century was experiencing waves of enthusiasm for ancient Egyptian culture, fueled by dramatic archaeological discoveries, the opening of the Suez Canal, and growing European fascination with Oriental aesthetics. Nefertiti's bust arrived just as audiences in Europe and America were hungry for images that combined classical beauty with exotic ancient wisdom. Her distinctive features, the elongated neck, elegant cheekbones, serene expression, and especially that iconic tall blue crown, became instantly recognizable symbols that transcended cultural and linguistic boundaries. The image was reproduced on everything from high-fashion magazine covers to tourist postcards, transforming a 300-400-year-old sculpture into one of the most widely distributed artworks in human history. But the popularization of Nefertiti's image also led to the creation of mythologized versions of her story that often bore little resemblance to historical reality. Popular culture transformed her into a symbol of eternal feminine beauty, exotic sensuality, and ancient mystical wisdom, characteristics that reflected modern fantasies rather than documented historical facts. Hollywood predictably embraced Nefertiti as perfect material for epic historical dramas. She appeared in numerous films, usually portrayed as a passionate beauty whose romantic relationships drove the political events of ancient Egypt. These portrayals typically emphasized personal drama and sexual intrigue while ignoring her actual political achievements and religious innovations. The Art Deco movement of the 1920s and 1930s adopted Nefertiti's profile as a symbol of sophisticated modernist aesthetics. Her image appeared in fashion designs, architectural decorations, jewelry, and luxury consumer goods, associating her with contemporary ideas about streamlined elegance and artistic innovation. Modern feminist movements have reclaimed Nefertiti as a symbol of female empowerment and political achievement, emphasizing her unprecedented authority as co-ruler of ancient Egypt, rather than focusing solely on her physical beauty. This interpretation presents her as an early example of successful female leadership in male-dominated societies. The beauty industry has been particularly enthusiastic about appropriating Nefertiti's image, using her bust to sell everything from cosmetics to plastic surgery procedures. She has become a universal standard for feminine beauty across cultures, despite the fact that her artistic representation was created according to ancient Egyptian aesthetic conventions that were quite different from modern beauty standards. Academic scholars have struggled to separate the documented historical figure from the mythologized icon that has been created by decades of cultural appropriation and artistic interpretation. The challenge is distinguishing between what we actually know about Nefertiti's life and achievements versus what we project onto her based on contemporary assumptions about beauty, power, and female authority. The result is that Nefertiti exists simultaneously as a historical person and as a cultural symbol, with the symbolic version often overwhelming historical reality. She has become more famous as an image than as an individual, which is both a tribute to the power of her artistic representation and a challenge for historians trying to understand her actual role in ancient Egyptian civilization. Contemporary artists continue to reinterpret Nefertiti's image, creating works that comment on everything from cultural appropriation to beauty standards to female empowerment. Her bust has been 3D scanned and reproduced, modified by digital artists, and reimagined in countless contemporary artworks that use her image to explore modern themes. Modern scientific analysis of Nefertiti's famous bust has revealed fascinating details about ancient Egyptian artistic techniques, the historical accuracy of her portrayal, and even potential clues about her physical appearance and health. Advanced imaging technology, chemical analysis, and medical examination have transformed our understanding of both the artwork and the woman it represents. CT scans of the Berlin bust conducted in 2009 revealed that the sculpture consists of a limestone core covered with layers of stucco and paint, a sophisticated construction technique that allowed ancient artists to create incredibly detailed and lifelike representations. The scans also showed that the bust had been damaged and repaired in ancient times, suggesting it was considered valuable enough to preserve even after suffering injury. More intriguingly, the CT analysis revealed that beneath the outer painted surface lies a slightly different version of Nefertiti's face, with more prominent cheekbones, a bump on the nose, and deeper lines around the mouth. This suggests that the final version was idealized compared to the original sculpture, raising questions about how accurately any ancient royal portrait represented the actual appearance of its subject. Chemical analysis of the pigments used in the bust has provided insights into ancient Egyptian artistic materials and techniques. The famous blue crown was painted with a pigment called Egyptian blue, one of the first synthetic colors ever created. The flesh tones were achieved using a combination of ochre, calcium carbonate, and other minerals that would have been expensive and difficult to obtain. The missing left eye of the bust has been the subject of considerable speculation. Some scholars suggest it was never inserted, indicating that the sculpture was unfinished when Amarna was abandoned. Others propose that the eye was removed in ancient times, possibly for ritual reasons, or to prevent the statue from seeing and therefore possessing spiritual power. Medical analysis of other Amarna period mummies and artistic representations has suggested that the royal family may have suffered from genetic disorders associated with inbreeding, including Marfan syndrome or other connective tissue disorders. However, applying these diagnoses to Nefertiti is complicated by the fact that her artistic representations may have been idealized rather than medically accurate. Forensic facial reconstruction techniques have been applied to skulls from the Amarna period in attempts to determine what members of the royal family might have actually looked like. While none of these reconstructions can definitively be identified as Nefertiti, they provide insights into the physical characteristics of people living in ancient Egypt during her lifetime. Analysis of hair samples and textile fragments from Amarna has revealed details about ancient Egyptian fashion, hygiene practices, and daily life during Nefertiti's reign. These studies suggest that the royal family had access to luxury goods from across the ancient world, including silk from Asia and rare dyes from the Mediterranean. Advanced photographic techniques have been used to analyze the construction and painting methods used in other Amarna period artworks, revealing the sophisticated artistic techniques that created the distinctive naturalistic style associated with Nefertiti's reign. These studies show that Amarna artists were experimenting with new approaches to depicting human anatomy and emotion. The scientific analysis of Nefertiti's artistic representations has also contributed to broader discussions about ancient Egyptian society, gender roles, and royal authority. The level of detail and care invested in her portrayal suggests that she was considered extremely important, while the idealization evident in her artistic representation reflects broader cultural values about beauty, power, and divine authority. More than 3 millennia after her death, Nefertiti's influence extends far beyond her role as an ancient Egyptian queen to encompass contributions to religion, politics, art, and culture that continue to resonate in the modern world. Her legacy demonstrates how individual vision and courage can challenge established systems and create lasting change, even when the immediate results appear to be failures. The religious revolution that Nefertiti co-led with Akhenaten represented one of humanity's earliest experiments in monotheism, predating the development of Hebrew monotheistic traditions and certainly preceding Christian and Islamic theology. While the Aten revolution ultimately failed in Egypt, it established important precedents for religious reform and demonstrated that established spiritual systems could be challenged and transformed. Modern scholars have debated whether the Amarna period influenced later monotheistic traditions, particularly the development of Hebrew religion during the Babylonian exile. While direct connections are difficult to prove, the Aten revolution showed that monotheism could serve as an organizing principle for large-scale societies, providing a model that later religious reformers might have adapted for their own purposes. Nefertiti's unprecedented political authority as a female co-ruler established precedents for women's leadership that, while not immediately followed in Egypt, demonstrated that gender-based restrictions on power were cultural conventions rather than natural laws. Her example provided inspiration for later female rulers who faced similar challenges in claiming authority that their societies reserved for men. The artistic revolution associated with the Amarna period, which Nefertiti helped inspire and promote, broke free from centuries of rigid Egyptian artistic conventions and created more naturalistic styles that influenced art and sculpture for generations. The famous bust of Nefertiti exemplifies this new aesthetic approach, combining idealized beauty with individual personality in ways that previous Egyptian art had rarely achieved. Her role in transforming the Egyptian royal family from distant divine figures into relatable human beings who displayed affection, intimacy, and emotional connection revolutionized how monarchy could present itself to subjects. This humanization of royal authority created new possibilities for political legitimacy based on personal charisma rather than just traditional institutional power. The systematic documentation and artistic representation of Nefertiti's reign has provided modern historians with unprecedented insights into ancient Egyptian politics, religion, and daily life. The Amarna archives have become one of the most important sources for understanding ancient Near Eastern diplomacy and international relations. Her mysterious disappearance and the subsequent erasure of her achievements from official Egyptian records ironically enhanced rather than diminished her historical significance. The unanswered questions about her fate have kept her story alive in ways that complete documentation might not have achieved, making her a perpetual subject of investigation and speculation. Modern archaeological discoveries have gradually restored Nefertiti to her rightful place as one of ancient history's most important political figures, while popular culture has transformed her into a global icon of beauty, mystery, and female empowerment. She exists simultaneously as a historical person and as a cultural symbol, with both versions contributing to her enduring influence. The ongoing search for her tomb represents more than just archaeological curiosity. It reflects humanity's continued fascination with individuals who transcended the limitations of their times and achieved something unprecedented. whether or not her burial site is ever discovered. Nefertiti's real monument is the example she set of how vision, intelligence, and courage can enable individuals to reshape the world around them. In an era when discussions of gender equality, religious tolerance, and cultural innovation remain relevant, Nefertiti's story offers both inspiration and caution. She demonstrated that dramatic social changes are possible, but also showed how difficult it can be to sustain revolutionary transformations against entrenched opposition. In the end, Nefertiti's greatest achievement may be that she has remained fundamentally unknowable, despite decades of scholarly investigation, archaeological exploration, and popular fascination. She has successfully maintained her mysteries while simultaneously inspiring countless theories, artistic interpretations, and cultural adaptations that keep her story alive across generations and cultures. The historical Nefertiti, the woman who lived, ruled, and disappeared in ancient Egypt, was undoubtedly remarkable for her political achievements, religious innovations, and cultural influence. She co-ruled one of the ancient world's greatest empires, pioneered religious reforms that anticipated later monotheistic traditions, and established precedents for female authority that influenced subsequent generations of women leaders. But the mythical Nefertiti, the eternal symbol of beauty, mystery, and female power, has achieved a kind of immortality that transcends historical documentation. Her image has become a universal symbol that different cultures interpret according to their own values and aspirations, making her simultaneously ancient and contemporary, specific and universal. Perhaps this dual existence is fitting for someone who spent her life challenging conventional boundaries and defying traditional expectations. Nefertiti refused to be limited by the restrictions that her society placed on women, and she continues to refuse being confined by the boundaries between history and legend, between documentation and imagination, between ancient achievement and modern inspiration. She represents the enduring human fascination with individuals who transcend their circumstances and achieve something that seemed impossible according to the conventional wisdom of their times. In a world that often appears dominated by limitations and pessimistic assumptions about human potential, Nefertiti embodies the possibility that vision, courage, and intelligence can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The mystery surrounding her origins, her disappearance, and her final fate has become part of her appeal rather than a limitation on our understanding. She demonstrates that some historical figures become more powerful as symbols than they ever were as individuals, inspiring people across centuries and cultures to imagine new possibilities for human achievement. Modern technology continues to reveal new details about her life and times, but each discovery seems to raise as many questions as it answers. The more we learn about Nefertiti, the more complex and fascinating she becomes, challenging simple interpretations while confirming that she was far more significant than traditional sources had suggested. Her famous bust continues to draw millions of visitors to museums around the world, proving that ancient art can speak across millennia to touch something fundamental in human experience. People see in her face not just beauty, but intelligence, strength, and a kind of serene confidence that suggests she knew secrets that the rest of us are still trying to discover. In academic conferences and popular culture, in archaeological expeditions and artistic interpretations, in feminist scholarship and religious studies, Nefertiti continues to inspire new investigations and interpretations. She has become a lens through which we examine questions about power, gender, spirituality, and the possibilities for individual agency in the face of institutional opposition. The woman who co-ruled ancient Egypt for less than 2 decades has influenced human culture for more than 3 millennia, demonstrating that historical impact isn't always proportional to the length of one's life or reign. Sometimes the most lasting influence comes from those who dare to imagine alternatives to existing systems and have the courage to attempt implementing their visions. Nefertiti remains Egypt's beautiful queen, not just because of her physical appearance, but because of the beautiful possibility she represents, that individuals can transcend their circumstances, challenge established limitations, and create changes that echo through history long after they themselves have vanished into mystery. In a sense, her disappearance from the historical record was the perfect ending to an impossible life. She came from unknown origins, achieved unprecedented power, pioneered revolutionary changes, and then vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared, leaving behind questions that may never be answered and an example that continues to inspire new generations of people who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things must always be. She didn't just live in history. She became history itself, eternal and ever-changing, mysterious and inspiring, beautiful in ways that transcend physical appearance to encompass the beauty of human potential realized against impossible odds. Picture this. You're a Phoenician princess whose brother just murdered your husband for his gold, so you fake a religious pilgrimage, steal your brother's treasury, and sail across the Mediterranean to found what will become one of history's greatest cities and Rome's most dangerous rival. The good news? You're about to establish Carthage and become one of the ancient world's most legendary queens. The bad news? Your story is going to be so epic that Roman poets will spend centuries writing fan fiction about you that bears absolutely no resemblance to what actually happened, but sounds way more romantic than shrewd political refugee builds commercial empire through brilliant urban planning and trade negotiations. Welcome to the extraordinary life of Dido, also known as Alyssa, a woman who proved that sometimes the best response to family betrayal and political assassination is to pack up your entire court, sail to North Africa, and build a civilization that will terrify your enemies for centuries. Her story is part historical fact, part ancient propaganda, and part pure legend, which makes perfect sense because founding Carthage was the kind of achievement that required someone capable of turning political disaster into commercial triumph while negotiating real estate deals with local kings who probably thought they were getting the better end of the bargain. But here's the thing about Dido's story. It's been so thoroughly romanticized by Roman poets and later European writers that most people know her as a tragic love interest, rather than as one of the ancient world's most brilliant political strategists and urban planners. It's like remembering Steve Jobs primarily for his dating life, rather than for revolutionizing personal computing. The historical Dido was a woman who orchestrated one of the most successful refugee operations in ancient history, negotiated complex international treaties, designed and built a city that would dominate Mediterranean commerce for centuries, and establish political institutions that would outlast the Roman Empire itself. The historical Dido lived in the 9th or 8th century BCE, during the height of Phoenician commercial expansion, when enterprising traders from cities like Tyre were establishing colonies throughout the Mediterranean, like ancient venture capitalists with ships, establishing trading posts and commercial networks that would transform the economic and political landscape of the entire region for centuries to come. The Phoenicians were the ancient world's master traders, the people who figured out that you could get rich by moving goods between places where they were cheap and places where they were expensive, and that this was generally more profitable and less dangerous than trying to conquer everyone in sight. Phoenician society was remarkably progressive by ancient standards, particularly regarding women's rights and commercial opportunities that enabled talented individuals to achieve positions of authority and influence that would have been impossible in most contemporary civilizations, where gender restrictions and social hierarchies limited advancement based on birth rather than ability or achievement. Phoenician women could own property, engage in business transactions, inherit wealth, and even rule kingdoms in their own right, revolutionary concepts that made other ancient societies' heads spin with confusion and horror. The world that shaped Dido was one of maritime commerce, international diplomacy, and cultural exchange that required sophisticated understanding of multiple languages, trading customs, navigation techniques, and the complex web of relationships that made Mediterranean prosperity possible through peaceful interaction rather than constant warfare. It was like growing up in a combination of Harvard Business School and the United Nations, except with more sea monsters and significantly less reliable weather forecasting. Dido was born into the royal family of Tyre, one of the most powerful and prosperous Phoenician city-states, where she received the kind of education that prepared young nobles for leadership roles in a maritime commercial empire that required sophisticated understanding of navigation, trade, diplomacy, and the complex international relationships that made Phoenician prosperity possible through peaceful commerce rather than military conquest. Her education would have included languages, probably Phoenician, Egyptian, Assyrian, and various local dialects, along with mathematics for commercial calculations, geography for trade route planning, and the diplomatic skills necessary for negotiating with everyone from Berber chieftains to Egyptian pharaohs. Her marriage to Ikerbus, who served as high priest of Melkart and possessed enormous wealth through religious offerings and commercial investments, represented both personal alliance and political consolidation that strengthened royal authority while enhancing the economic resources available for Tyrian commercial expansion and diplomatic initiatives that maintained Phoenician independence against larger neighbouring empires. Ikerbus wasn't just wealthy, he was fantastically, embarrassingly attracting the wrong kind of attention wealthy, which in ancient politics was often a more dangerous condition than being poor. The assassination of Ikerbus by Dido's brother Pygmalion, who had become king of Tyre and coveted his brother-in-law's wealth, created the crisis that would transform Dido from Phoenician princess into legendary founder of Carthage through a combination of personal courage, political intelligence, and strategic planning that turned family betrayal into historical opportunity. Pygmalion's approach to wealth redistribution was straightforward: kill the wealthy relative and redistribute his wealth to yourself. It was like ancient private equity, except with more stabbing and less paperwork. Pygmalion's murder of Ikerbus was motivated by greed rather than politics, but it created political consequences that threatened Dido's safety and position while providing her with both motive and opportunity to challenge royal authority through the kind of dramatic action that separated legendary figures from ordinary victims of dynastic violence and family conflicts. The murder also revealed something important about Pygmalion's character. He was the kind of person who would kill family members for money, which suggested that Dido's life expectancy in Tyre was approximately equivalent to that of a mayfly in a hurricane. The escape from Tyre that Dido organised was a masterpiece of deception and political theatre that demonstrated her understanding of both human psychology and practical logistics required for successful refugee operations in an ancient world where political exiles typically ended up dead, enslaved, or forgotten, rather than founding new civilizations that would reshape Mediterranean history. Her plan was so clever that it would have impressed Odysseus, and so thoroughly executed that it would have made Machiavelli weep with envy. Her strategy involved convincing Pygmalion that she wanted to join him in Rome, requesting ships and crews for what appeared to be voluntary exile that would remove her as a potential threat to his authority, while actually providing her with the transportation and human resources necessary for establishing an independent colony far from Tyrian political control and royal retaliation. It was like convincing someone to give you the keys to their car, a full tank of gas, and a detailed roadmap by explaining that you wanted to drive to your own execution. The theft of Pygmalion's treasury was accomplished through a brilliant ruse involving bags of sand thrown overboard during a fake religious ceremony, creating the impression that she was disposing of her wealth in religious devotion while actually preserving it for funding her colonial expedition and providing the financial resources necessary for successful settlement and urban development in North Africa. The scene of Dido dramatically hurling bags into the sea while weeping about her desire to join her dead husband in the afterlife was pure theatre, except the bags contained sand while the actual treasure was safely hidden below deck. It was ancient performance art with a practical purpose. The followers who accompanied Dido in her escape included not just personal loyalists, but also Phoenician nobles, merchants, craftsmen, and sailors whose skills and connections would be essential for establishing a viable colony that could survive and prosper independently of Tyrian support, while maintaining the commercial networks and cultural traditions that made Phoenician civilization successful throughout the Mediterranean. She wasn't just escaping with random refugees, she was assembling the human resources necessary for building a new civilization from scratch, like recruiting a complete startup team, except the product was an entire city-state. Her choice of North Africa as a destination demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Mediterranean geography, commercial opportunities, and political conditions that made the region attractive for Phoenician colonization, while avoiding territories that were already controlled by major powers who might have prevented successful settlement or demanded tribute that could have undermined colonial independence and economic viability. North Africa was far enough from Tyre to avoid immediate retaliation, close enough to Mediterranean trade routes to maintain commercial connections, and politically fragmented enough to allow negotiation with local rulers who might welcome Phoenician commercial expertise and urban development. The negotiation with local Berber king Iarbas for land rights represented one of the most famous real estate transactions in ancient history, demonstrating both Dido's diplomatic skills and her understanding that successful colonization required legitimate arrangements with indigenous populations rather than simple conquest or illegal occupation that could have created ongoing conflicts and security problems. The fact that she was a foreign woman negotiating with a local king for territorial rights made the entire situation unprecedented and diplomatically complex. The famous story of the ox-hide deal, where Dido requested only as much land as could be enclosed by an ox-hide, then cut the hide into thin strips to encompass a much larger area, illustrates both her intelligence and the kind of creative problem-solving that enabled Phoenician traders to succeed in competitive international markets through innovation and careful attention to contractual details that could be exploited for maximum advantage. It was like ancient legal loophole exploitation, except more creative and significantly more consequential than modern contract disputes. Whether this story is historically accurate or legendary embellishment, it perfectly captures the essential character of Phoenician commercial culture, which emphasized clever negotiation and creative interpretation of agreements rather than brute force or simple deception. The ox-hide story has become so famous that it's taught in law schools as an example of literal interpretation versus intended meaning, though presumably ancient contract law was somewhat less developed than modern jurisprudence. The location that Dido chose for her new city was strategically brilliant, positioned on a peninsula that provided natural harbour protection while controlling access to maritime trade routes that connected the western and eastern Mediterranean, creating the geographical foundation for commercial prosperity that would make Carthage one of the ancient world's greatest trading powers. The site combined defensive advantages with commercial opportunities in ways that revealed sophisticated understanding of both military security and economic development. The foundation of Carthage around 814 BCE represented more than just successful refugee settlement. It was the creation of an entirely new model for Mediterranean civilization that combined Phoenician commercial expertise with North African agricultural resources and strategic positioning that enabled systematic expansion of trade networks and political influence throughout the Western Mediterranean region. It was like establishing Silicon Valley in the ancient world, except instead of technology startups, the specialty was maritime commerce and international trade. The early challenges of establishing Carthage required solutions to problems that would have defeated most ancient leaders: how to feed and house thousands of refugees while establishing defensive fortifications, commercial infrastructure, and governmental institutions that could manage complex urban populations drawn from different cultural backgrounds and speaking various languages. Dido essentially had to invent urban planning, municipal government, and multicultural integration simultaneously, while maintaining security against potential external threats and internal conflicts. The city that Dido planned and constructed reflected both Phoenician urban design principles and innovative adaptations to local conditions that created a uniquely Carthaginian synthesis of Eastern Mediterranean sophistication with Western Mediterranean opportunities and challenges that required new approaches to urban planning, commercial organization, and political administration. The urban design included separate districts for different economic activities, residential areas organized by social status and cultural background, and public spaces designed to accommodate the religious and civic ceremonies that maintained community cohesion. The harbour facilities that Dido developed for Carthage became the foundation for the city's commercial dominance, featuring engineering innovations that enabled simultaneous accommodation of merchant vessels, fishing fleets, and military ships, while providing storage and processing facilities for the goods that flowed through Carthaginian trade networks, connecting North Africa with Spain, Italy, and the Eastern Mediterranean. The harbour complex was essentially an ancient logistics hub designed to maximize efficiency while maintaining security. The commercial success of early Carthage under Dido's leadership established the economic foundations that would support centuries of Carthaginian expansion and prosperity, while creating the institutional precedents and cultural traditions that enabled the city to evolve from Phoenician colony into independent Mediterranean power, capable of challenging Rome itself for control over Western Mediterranean trade and territory. The economic model that Dido established emphasized value-added processing and international arbitrage rather than simple resource extraction or territorial conquest. The religious and cultural institutions that Dido established in Carthage preserved essential Phoenician traditions while adapting to local conditions and opportunities that required synthesis of different cultural elements into a distinctively Carthaginian civilization that maintained connections to Phoenician heritage while developing independent identity and institutional structures. The religious practices combined traditional Phoenician deities with local African spiritual traditions and various Mediterranean influences that reflected Carthage's role as international commercial center. The legal and administrative systems that Dido created for governing Carthage had to accommodate the complex needs of a diverse urban population that included Phoenician refugees, local Berber allies, international merchants, craftsmen from various Mediterranean cultures, and slaves from multiple ethnic backgrounds who all needed to coexist peacefully while contributing to urban prosperity and security. It was like creating a functional United Nations except with actual enforcement mechanisms and practical economic incentives for cooperation. But the historical Dido's remarkable achievement in founding Carthage was later overshadowed by the literary legend that Roman poets created centuries after her death, transforming her from successful political refugee and city founder into tragic romantic heroine whose love affair with Aeneas provided moral justification for Roman imperial expansion and Carthaginian destruction. The transformation was so complete that most people today know Virgil's fictional Dido rather than the historical figure who actually accomplished one of the ancient world's most impressive feats of political leadership and urban development. The literary transformation of Dido's story reveals as much about Roman propaganda needs as it does about ancient attitudes toward female leadership and the political uses of romantic mythology in justifying imperial conquest and cultural dominance over defeated enemies whose actual achievements had to be minimized or reinterpreted to support Roman claims about civilizational superiority. Roman writers needed to explain why Carthage had been such a dangerous enemy, but they also needed to justify its destruction, so they created a narrative that acknowledged Carthaginian capabilities while attributing them to emotional instability and foreign corruption, rather than genuine political and commercial excellence. Virgil's Aeneid transformed Dido from brilliant political strategist into love-struck queen, whose passion for Aeneas led to personal destruction and political disaster, creating a narrative that simultaneously explained Carthaginian hostility toward Rome, while suggesting that Eastern rulers were too emotional and irrational for effective long-term leadership. It was character assassination disguised as epic poetry, and it was so effective that it became the dominant version of Dido's story for the next 2,000 years. The real irony of the Aeneid's treatment of Dido is that Virgil was trying to create a foundation myth for Roman imperial authority, but he accidentally created one of literature's most compelling portraits of female political leadership and intellectual sophistication. Even his fictional Dido displays the kind of strategic thinking, cultural knowledge, and administrative competence that made the historical Dido such a formidable figure in Mediterranean politics. The foundation of Carthage under Dido's leadership was an achievement that required not just personal courage and intelligence, but also the kind of systematic planning and institutional innovation that separated successful colonization from failed settlement attempts that littered the ancient Mediterranean with abandoned towns and forgotten experiments in urban development. Archaeological evidence suggests that Carthage was planned as a major urban center from its very beginning, rather than growing organically from a small trading post or military outpost. The demographic planning that Dido accomplished in establishing Carthage required careful attention to population balance, skill distribution, and cultural integration that could create a stable urban community capable of defending itself while maintaining the commercial activities that provided economic foundation for continued growth and prosperity. She needed enough farmers to feed the city, enough craftsmen to produce trade goods, enough merchants to manage commercial networks, enough soldiers to provide security, and enough administrators to coordinate all these activities without creating bureaucratic paralysis. The early years of Carthage's development demonstrated Dido's understanding that urban success required more than just favorable geography and adequate funding. It needed careful attention to demographic planning, economic development, military security, and diplomatic relationships that could ensure long-term survival and prosperity in a competitive international environment where successful cities attracted both profitable opportunities and dangerous enemies who might prefer conquest to trade. The population of early Carthage included not just Phoenician refugees from Tyre, but also recruited settlers from other Phoenician cities, local Berber populations who were integrated into the urban community, and various merchants and craftsmen who were attracted by commercial opportunities that Dido's policies and urban planning had created through systematic attention to economic development and trade facilitation. The city became a magnet for talented individuals from throughout the Mediterranean who could contribute skills and connections that enhanced Carthaginian prosperity. The agricultural development of Carthaginian territory demonstrated Dido's recognition that urban prosperity required rural support systems that could provide food security and raw materials for manufacturing while creating the economic surplus necessary for maintaining military forces and supporting the commercial activities that made Phoenician civilization profitable and sustainable. The agricultural policies she established created incentives for intensive cultivation and agricultural innovation that made Carthaginian territory unusually productive. The military organization that Dido established for Carthaginian defense reflected both Phoenician traditions and innovative adaptations to local conditions that required different approaches to security challenges than those that had characterized Eastern Mediterranean urban warfare and commercial protection in regions where Phoenician cities had operated for generations. Carthaginian military forces combined professional soldiers with citizen militias and allied forces from Berber tribes that provided different capabilities for different types of security challenges. The diplomatic relationships that Dido negotiated with neighboring Berber tribes and other Mediterranean powers created the international framework that enabled Carthaginian commercial expansion while avoiding the kind of military conflicts that could have destroyed the new settlement before it had established sufficient strength and resources for effective resistance against external threats. Her diplomatic strategy emphasized mutually beneficial relationships rather than dominance or submission. The legal and administrative systems that Dido implemented in Carthage provided institutional foundations for urban governance that could manage the complex relationships between different population groups while maintaining the commercial networks and cultural traditions that made Phoenician civilization successful throughout the Mediterranean world. The legal code she established had to balance Phoenician traditions with local customs and practical requirements for governing a diverse urban population. The religious practices that Dido established in Carthage preserved essential Phoenician spiritual traditions while accommodating local religious customs and creating the cultural synthesis that enabled different population groups to cooperate effectively in building and maintaining the new urban civilization that was emerging under her leadership and institutional innovation. Religious tolerance was essential for maintaining social cohesion in a multicultural urban environment. The economic policies that characterized early Carthaginian development under Dido's direction emphasized commercial expansion and trade facilitation rather than territorial conquest or agricultural exploitation, creating the foundation for the commercial empire that would eventually challenge Roman control over Mediterranean trade and territorial expansion. The economic model emphasized value creation through trade rather than wealth extraction through conquest. The urban planning achievements that Dido accomplished in designing and constructing Carthage established aesthetic and functional standards for Mediterranean urban development while creating the physical infrastructure necessary for supporting large populations and complex economic activities that required sophisticated coordination and systematic attention to logistical challenges. The city design incorporated both beauty and functionality in ways that impressed visitors from throughout the ancient world. The cultural institutions that Dido created in Carthage provided educational and artistic opportunities that maintained Phoenician intellectual traditions while encouraging innovation and cultural development that reflected the unique conditions and opportunities that characterized the new North African urban environment that was emerging under her leadership. These institutions attracted scholars, artists, and intellectuals from throughout the Mediterranean region. The technological innovations that emerged in Carthage under Dido's patronage included advances in shipbuilding, navigation, metallurgy, and urban engineering that enhanced both commercial capabilities and military effectiveness, while creating the technological foundation for continued Carthaginian expansion and development throughout the Mediterranean world. Carthaginian technological development combined practical innovation with systematic research and development. The legacy of Dido's achievement in founding Carthage extended far beyond her personal lifetime to encompass the entire subsequent history of Carthaginian civilization that would become one of the ancient world's most important commercial and political powers, while maintaining the institutional foundations and cultural values that she had established during the crucial early period of urban development and colonial settlement. The immediate success of Carthage under Dido's leadership created the precedent and model for subsequent Phoenician colonial expansion throughout the Western Mediterranean, demonstrating that systematic planning and competent leadership could create viable urban settlements that could survive and prosper independently of their mother cities while maintaining beneficial commercial and cultural relationships. Her success inspired similar colonial ventures throughout the region. But Dido's greatest challenge wasn't establishing Carthage. It was maintaining her independence and authority as a female ruler in an ancient world where political leadership was typically reserved for men and where successful women leaders often faced pressure to accept male authority through marriage alliances that could provide political legitimacy while potentially undermining their personal autonomy and decision-making authority. The pressure that Dido faced to marry Iarbas, the Berber king who had provided the land for Carthaginian settlement, represented exactly the kind of political challenge that tested female leadership in the ancient world, where diplomatic relationships and territorial security often required personal sacrifices that male rulers rarely had to consider when making strategic decisions about alliance systems and international relationships. Marriage to Iarbas would have provided political benefits for Carthage, but it would also have subjected Dido to male authority and potentially compromised Carthaginian independence. The domestic political pressures that Dido faced from within her own court included advisors and nobles who believed that marriage to a local king would enhance Carthaginian security while providing access to Berber military forces and territorial resources that could strengthen the new city against external threats and internal challenges. These pressures reflected both practical political considerations and cultural assumptions about female leadership that even progressive Phoenician society hadn't completely overcome. The international implications of Dido's marriage decision extended beyond personal choice to encompass questions about Carthaginian independence, succession arrangements, and the future direction of the city's political and commercial development that could be affected by royal marriage alliances and the diplomatic obligations that such alliances typically created for both partners and their respective political communities. Dido's response to marriage pressure demonstrated both her political intelligence and her commitment to maintaining Carthaginian independence, even when personal sacrifice was required to preserve the institutional autonomy and cultural identity that she had created through years of careful planning and systematic development of urban civilization that represented more than just her personal achievement. Her refusal to accept forced marriage was simultaneously personal statement and political decision. The historical accounts of Dido's death vary significantly, with some sources suggesting suicide to avoid forced marriage, while others propose different explanations for her disappearance from historical records, but all versions emphasize her determination to maintain personal and political independence, even when circumstances made such independence extremely difficult to preserve through conventional diplomatic or military means. Her death became another legend that overshadowed her actual political and cultural achievements. The transformation of Dido from historical figure into literary legend began almost immediately after her death, as her remarkable achievement in founding Carthage inspired stories and myths that emphasized different aspects of her character and accomplishments depending on the political and cultural needs of the societies that preserved and transmitted her story through oral and written traditions. The legend-making process reflected both genuine admiration for her achievements and political requirements for interpreting those achievements in ways that supported contemporary ideological and cultural objectives. The most famous literary treatment of Dido's story appears in Virgil's Aeneid, where she becomes a tragic romantic heroine whose love affair with Aeneas and subsequent suicide provide moral justification for Roman conquest of Carthage, while transforming her from successful political leader into symbol of Eastern passion and emotional instability that contrasted with Roman virtue and rational authority. Virgil's version became canonical despite its historical inaccuracy and obvious political motivations. Virgil's version of Dido's story, while historically inaccurate and politically motivated, became the dominant narrative tradition in European literature and culture, influencing countless subsequent artistic and literary treatments that emphasized romantic tragedy rather than political achievement and urban planning success that represented her actual historical significance and lasting contribution to Mediterranean civilization. The literary tradition essentially erased the historical Dido and replaced her with a fictional character who served Roman propaganda purposes. The feminist reclamation of Dido's historical achievement has emphasized her significance as one of the ancient world's most successful female political leaders, while challenging literary traditions that reduced her complex political and cultural accomplishments to simple romantic tragedy that served Roman propaganda purposes rather than historical accuracy or cultural understanding. Modern scholarship has worked to distinguish between historical evidence and literary invention in reconstructing Dido's actual career and achievements. The archaeological evidence from Carthage confirms many aspects of ancient accounts about Dido's urban planning and institutional achievements, while providing physical testimony to the sophisticated civilization that developed under her leadership and continued to flourish long after her death, demonstrating that her political and cultural legacy transcended whatever personal tragedies may have characterized her final years. Archaeological discoveries have validated many claims about early Carthaginian development that had been dismissed as legendary exaggeration. The comparative analysis of Dido's achievement with other ancient colonial foundations reveals both the unique features of her approach to urban development and the common patterns that characterize successful Mediterranean settlement, while highlighting the particular challenges and opportunities that faced female leaders in ancient political and commercial environments. Her success was exceptional, but not completely unprecedented in the context of Phoenician commercial culture. The economic impact of Dido's foundation of Carthage affected Mediterranean trade patterns and commercial development for centuries, creating new opportunities for cultural exchange and economic cooperation, while establishing precedents for urban planning and institutional innovation that influenced subsequent colonial development throughout the ancient world. Carthaginian commercial networks eventually extended from Spain to the Black Sea and from Britain to sub-Saharan Africa. The political significance of Carthaginian independence under Dido's leadership demonstrated possibilities for alternative forms of government and cultural organization that challenged the imperial models that characterized most ancient Mediterranean civilizations, while showing how commercial prosperity and diplomatic skill could provide foundations for political autonomy and cultural achievement. Carthage became a model for successful republican government that influenced later political development. The religious and cultural synthesis that Dido achieved in founding Carthage created new forms of Mediterranean civilization that combined different traditions and practices in ways that enhanced both cultural diversity and political cooperation, while maintaining the spiritual foundations that connected urban development to traditional values and community identity. Carthaginian culture became distinctively international while remaining authentically Phoenician. The military and strategic implications of Carthaginian development under Dido's direction affected Mediterranean balance of power and territorial relationships for generations, creating new centers of political authority and commercial influence that challenged existing hegemonies, while demonstrating how effective leadership and systematic planning could transform regional political conditions. Carthaginian military innovations eventually challenged Roman dominance throughout the Western Mediterranean. The intellectual and artistic legacy of Dido's achievement influenced Mediterranean cultural development through educational institutions and cultural practices that preserved and transmitted knowledge, while encouraging innovation and creative expression that reflected the unique conditions and opportunities that characterized Carthaginian civilization under her leadership and institutional development. Carthaginian schools and libraries attracted students and scholars from throughout the ancient world. The technological and engineering advances that emerged from Carthaginian development under Dido's leadership included innovations in shipbuilding, harbor construction, urban planning, and agricultural techniques that enhanced both commercial capabilities and quality of life, while creating technological foundations for continued development and expansion that would characterize Carthaginian civilization for centuries. Carthaginian engineering achievements rivaled anything produced in the ancient world. The historical methodology required to distinguish between factual accounts of Dido's achievement and later literary elaborations illustrates both the challenges of studying ancient women's history and the importance of archaeological evidence and comparative analysis in reconstructing historical realities from sources that were often influenced by political propaganda and cultural stereotypes. Recovering the historical Dido requires careful analysis of multiple types of evidence and systematic attention to the political context that shaped historical accounts. The contemporary relevance of Dido's example lies in her demonstration that individual vision and systematic planning could create lasting institutional achievements while showing how cultural synthesis and commercial innovation could provide alternatives to military conquest and territorial expansion as foundations for political development and civilizational advancement. Her approach to leadership emphasized cooperation and mutual benefit rather than domination and exploitation. The enduring fascination with Dido's story reflects both her remarkable historical achievement in founding one of the ancient world's greatest cities and her symbolic importance as a representative of female leadership, cultural innovation, and the possibilities for creating new forms of civilization through courage, intelligence, and systematic attention to the practical requirements of urban development and institutional sustainability. In the end, Dido proved that being the legendary Queen of Carthage meant more than just founding a city. It meant creating a new model for Mediterranean civilization that combined commercial prosperity with cultural sophistication while demonstrating how effective leadership could transform political disaster into historical opportunity. Her achievement lasted for centuries and influenced the entire subsequent development of Western Mediterranean civilization, making her one of history's most successful examples of how individual vision and institutional innovation could create lasting legacies that transcended immediate political circumstances and personal tragedies. The fact that Roman poets had to transform her into a tragic romantic heroine just proves how threatening her actual achievement was to imperial propaganda that needed to diminish Carthaginian capabilities and justify Roman conquest through cultural stereotypes rather than honest acknowledgement of Carthaginian political and commercial accomplishments that had created one of Rome's most dangerous and successful rivals. Not bad for someone who supposedly wouldn't have lasted a day in medieval times, and certainly remarkable for a political refugee who turned family betrayal into the foundation of an empire that would challenge Rome itself for control over the Mediterranean world. Sometimes the best revenge is building a civilization that your enemies will spend centuries trying to destroy, and even longer trying to forget, while creating institutions and cultural achievements that outlast the empires that conquered them and influence human development for millennia after the original conflicts have been resolved and the political disputes that motivated them have been forgotten by everyone except historians and poets who understand that the most important victories are often achieved by those who lose the immediate battles but win the longer struggle for historical memory and cultural influence. Picture this. It's a warm summer day in 1776, and somewhere in Philadelphia, a group of rebels has just done something that would have gotten them hanged in any sensible monarchy. They've declared independence from the most powerful empire on earth. These weren't just any rebels, they were lawyers, merchants, and plantation owners who had somehow convinced themselves that they could take on the British Empire and win. The audacity was breathtaking. The stupidity was arguably even more impressive. And yet, fast forward to today, and millions of people are setting off fireworks, eating hot dogs, and wearing ridiculous patriotic clothing to celebrate that moment of magnificent audacity. Welcome to the wonderful, weird, and sometimes completely bonkers world of national celebrations, where entire countries throw parties to remember the time they became countries, usually involving explosions, excessive food consumption, and collective amnesia about how unlikely their success actually was. National celebrations are humanity's way of throwing birthday parties for abstract concepts, and when you really think about it, that's both profoundly meaningful and slightly unhinged. Think about it. We've created elaborate festivals to celebrate the existence of invisible lines drawn on maps by people who probably argued about where to put them over brandy and cigars. We commemorate moments when groups of people decided they were no longer the same group of people they used to be, often based on decisions made by individuals who had never met most of the people they were supposedly representing. And we honor the signing of documents that most celebrants have never actually read, couldn't understand if they tried, and probably wouldn't agree with entirely if they did understand them. It's delightfully absurd when you step back and think about it. but it's also profoundly human. We need these celebrations because they help us answer one of the most fundamental questions of existence. Who are we, and why should we care about each other? In a world where most of our daily interactions are with strangers, where we're connected to global supply chains and international networks that we barely understand, where our individual actions seem increasingly insignificant in the face of massive social and economic forces, national celebrations provide a way to feel part of something larger, more meaningful, and more enduring than our individual lives. But here's what makes national celebrations truly fascinating. They're not just about history, and they're definitely not just about having a good time. They're about identity, belonging, memory, and hope, all wrapped up in a package that usually involves parades, speeches, and way too much food. They're about taking the messy, complicated, often contradictory experience of living in a political community, dealing with taxes, following laws, participating in elections, tolerating neighbors you can't stand, and transforming it into something worth celebrating. Every national holiday is essentially a country looking in the mirror and deciding what story it wants to tell about itself, what achievements it wants to emphasize, what struggles it wants to remember, and what values it wants to pass on to the next generation. Some of these stories are genuinely inspiring tales of courage, sacrifice, and democratic achievement. Others are convenient fictions that gloss over uncomfortable truths and whitewash complicated histories. And some are flat-out propaganda disguised as patriotism, designed more to manufacture consent than to celebrate genuine achievement. The challenge for any society is figuring out how to create national celebrations that honor real achievements while acknowledging real failures, that inspire patriotic feeling without encouraging nationalist delusion, and that bring people together around shared values without excluding those who don't fit the dominant narrative. The story of national celebrations is also the story of how modern nations invented themselves, often out of whole cloth and frequently against considerable odds. Before the rise of nation-states, people identified primarily with their local communities, their religious groups, their tribal affiliations, or their loyalty to particular rulers. The idea that millions of strangers should consider themselves part of the same political family simply because they happened to be born within the same borders, spoke related languages, or shared certain cultural traditions was a revolutionary concept that required some serious cultural engineering and no small amount of propaganda. National celebrations became one of the primary tools for creating this new kind of identity, for convincing people that they should care about the welfare of folks they'd never met just because they shared the same passport, flag, or national anthem. This was no small feat. How do you create emotional bonds between a farmer in rural Kentucky and a factory worker in Detroit? How do you convince a Bavarian peasant that he has more in common with a Prussian aristocrat than with an Austrian peasant who lives just across the valley? How do you persuade a Tamil fisherman and a Punjabi landowner that they're both equally Indian? National celebrations provided part of the answer by creating shared experiences, common symbols, and collective memories that could transcend local differences and regional loyalties. And if you think planning a family reunion is complicated, trying to coordinate schedules, accommodate dietary restrictions, manage personality conflicts, and somehow create an event that will satisfy everyone, from your progressive college-age niece to your conservative grandfather, imagine trying to create a national celebration that somehow represents the experiences and values of millions of diverse people spread across vast territories, speaking different languages, practicing different religions, and holding wildly different political opinions. Our political ancestors had to figure out which historical moments were worth commemorating without reopening old wounds or excluding important constituencies. They had to determine which symbols would unite rather than divide, which required careful navigation of religious, ethnic, and regional sensitivities. They had to decide which traditions would inspire loyalty without alienating important populations who might have different cultural backgrounds or historical experiences, and they had to figure out how to throw a party that would make people proud to be part of something larger than themselves, while still acknowledging the diversity and complexity of the national community they were trying to celebrate. The fact that any of these celebrations succeeded in creating genuine national sentiment is a testament to human creativity, political skill, and our apparently inexhaustible capacity for turning abstract concepts into reasons to light things on fire, eat cake, and wave flags. The fact that many of them also created exclusionary narratives, suppressed minority voices, and perpetuated historical myths is a reminder that nation-building is always a political process with political consequences, and that the stories we tell about ourselves have real impacts on how we treat each other. The earliest forms of national celebration weren't really national in the modern sense. They were imperial or dynastic celebrations that honoured rulers rather than countries, individual achievements rather than collective identity, personal power rather than popular sovereignty. Ancient civilizations like Egypt, Persia, and Rome created elaborate festivals to celebrate the achievements of their emperors, the anniversaries of military victories, or the founding of their empires. These weren't celebrations of popular sovereignty or democratic values. They were displays of imperial power designed to remind subjects who was in charge and why they should be grateful for the privilege of being conquered. But these early celebrations did establish many of the basic elements that would later be incorporated into genuinely national holidays. They created traditions of public spectacle, communal participation, symbolic representation, and collective memory that would prove adaptable to very different political systems and cultural contexts. They demonstrated that large-scale celebrations could serve important political functions, building loyalty, creating shared identity, reinforcing social hierarchies, and providing outlets for popular energy that might otherwise be directed toward rebellion or social unrest. Roman triumph parades exemplified this early model of state celebration and provide a fascinating glimpse into how political communities have always used public spectacle to create meaning and build loyalty. When a Roman general achieved a significant military victory, he would be granted a triumph, a massive public spectacle that could last for days and involved virtually the entire population of Rome. The celebration included parades of captured enemies who would be displayed as trophies before being executed or enslaved, elaborate displays of looted treasure that demonstrated the material benefits of imperial expansion, elaborate sacrificial ceremonies that honored the gods who had supposedly granted victory, and massive public feasting that allowed ordinary citizens to share in the bounty of conquest. These events served multiple functions that would become standard features of political celebrations throughout history. They honored the achievements of successful commanders, demonstrating that the political system rewarded merit and success. They demonstrated Roman military superiority to both citizens and potential enemies, serving as both celebration and intimidation. They provided opportunities for the general population to participate in the glory of imperial success, creating emotional connections between individual citizens and imperial achievement. And they redistributed wealth through public feasting and games, providing material benefits that helped maintain popular support for the imperial system. But even these early imperial celebrations contained seeds of the more democratic national celebrations that would emerge centuries later. Roman triumphs weren't just about individual generals, they were about Roman identity, Roman values, and Roman destiny. Citizens who participated in these celebrations weren't just watching a parade, they were affirming their membership in a political community that was destined to rule the world, expressing their pride in Roman achievements and renewing their commitment to Roman greatness. The celebrations created shared experiences that bound diverse populations together under the umbrella of Roman identity, even as that identity was defined primarily in terms of military conquest and imperial domination rather than democratic participation or popular sovereignty. Medieval kingdoms developed their own versions of royal celebrations that served similar functions but reflected the different political structures of feudal society. Coronations, royal weddings, and the anniversaries of important battles became occasions for elaborate festivities that demonstrated royal power while providing opportunities for subjects to express their loyalty. These celebrations often included elements that would become standard features of later national holidays: public processions, special foods, temporary suspension of normal social rules, and participation by people from all social classes. The key difference between these medieval celebrations and modern national holidays was their focus on individual rulers rather than abstract political entities. Medieval subjects celebrated the king or queen, not the kingdom. They honoured specific dynastic achievements, not national ideals. They participated in royal celebrations as subjects expressing loyalty to their sovereign, not as citizens participating in their own governance. The concept of celebrating the nation itself, as distinct from its current ruler, was still centuries away. The transformation from dynastic celebrations to truly national celebrations began during the early modern period, as European kingdoms started developing stronger central governments and more coherent national identities. The Protestant Reformation played a crucial role in this transformation by creating religious divisions that often aligned with political boundaries. Countries like England began celebrating holidays that honoured not just royal authority, but also national religious identity, creating the foundation for more comprehensive forms of national celebration. Guy Fawkes Day in England, for example, commemorated not just the failure of a particular assassination attempt, but the preservation of Protestant England against Catholic threats. The celebration included elements that would become standard features of national holidays: public bonfires, communal festivities, symbolic representations of national enemies, and participation by people from across the social spectrum. It was still officially a celebration of royal survival, but it was also becoming a celebration of English identity, English values, and English destiny. The real breakthrough in national celebration came with the democratic revolutions of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The American Revolution created the first modern nation explicitly founded on abstract political principles rather than dynastic inheritance or religious authority. This created both the need and the opportunity for entirely new forms of national celebration that honoured democratic ideals rather than royal achievements. The 4th of July emerged as the prototype for modern national independence celebrations. Unlike royal holidays that honoured specific individuals, Independence Day celebrated an abstract concept: the idea that people could govern themselves. Unlike religious holidays that honoured divine authority, the 4th of July honoured human political achievement. Unlike traditional harvest festivals that celebrated seasonal cycles, Independence Day created an entirely artificial date that had significance only because a political community had decided it was significant. The early 4th of July celebrations established many of the conventions that would be copied by independence movements around the world. There were public readings of foundational documents, the Declaration of Independence, symbolic displays of national identity, flags, eagles, patriotic colours, communal activities that brought diverse populations together, parades, picnics, public speeches, and ritualized expressions of patriotic emotion, toasts, songs, pledges of allegiance. The celebrations were simultaneously backward-looking, commemorating past achievements, and forward-looking, reaffirming commitment to national ideals. But the American model also revealed some of the inherent tensions in national celebrations. Whose version of national history would be commemorated? Which values would be emphasized? How would celebrations handle the contradictions between national ideals and national realities? The early 4th of July celebrations often glossed over the existence of slavery, the displacement of Native Americans, and the exclusion of women from political participation. The holiday celebrated liberty and justice for all, while being organized by a society that denied liberty and justice to large portions of its population. The French Revolution created an even more radical model for national celebration that emphasized popular sovereignty and democratic participation. Bastille Day commemorated not just the overthrow of royal authority, but the emergence of the people as a political force. The early celebrations included elements that were explicitly democratic: public festivals organized by ordinary citizens, symbolic destructions of aristocratic privilege, mass participation in political ceremonies, and the creation of new civic rituals that replaced traditional religious observances. French Revolutionary celebrations also introduced innovations that would influence national holidays around the world. The Festival of Reason attempted to create entirely secular celebrations that honored human achievement rather than divine authority. The Festival of the Supreme Being tried to combine republican values with spiritual observance. The various festivals of revolutionary virtues created opportunities to celebrate abstract ideals like liberty, equality, and fraternity, rather than specific historical events or political leaders. These French experiments demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of revolutionary celebration. The festivals succeeded in creating powerful emotional experiences that reinforced republican identity and democratic values. They provided models for popular participation in national life that went far beyond traditional forms of political activity. They showed that nations could create meaningful celebrations without relying on royal authority or religious tradition. But the French Revolutionary celebrations also revealed how quickly national celebrations could become tools of political manipulation and social control. As the revolution became more radical and more violent, the festivals became increasingly ideological and exclusionary. Participation became less voluntary and more coercive. The celebrations that had begun as expressions of popular sovereignty gradually transformed into displays of revolutionary orthodoxy enforced by political authorities. The Napoleonic period created yet another model for national celebration that combined democratic rhetoric with imperial ambition. Napoleon's regime created holidays and festivals that honored both revolutionary achievements and imperial glory, democratic ideals and military conquest, popular sovereignty and personal dictatorship. The result was a hybrid form of national celebration that would influence European political culture for generations. The 19th century saw the spread of national celebrations across Europe and the Americas as more countries achieved independence or underwent democratic revolutions. Each new nation faced the same basic challenge: how to create celebrations that would unite diverse populations around shared national identity while honoring the specific historical experiences that had shaped their particular political community. Latin American independence movements created national celebrations that combined elements from the American and French models while incorporating distinctively local elements. Countries like Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil developed Independence Day celebrations that honored both the achievement of political freedom and the preservation of cultural identity. These celebrations often included indigenous and African cultural elements that had been excluded from European models, creating more inclusive forms of national identity while still emphasizing the unity of the national community. German and Italian unification movements created national celebrations that faced the particular challenge of uniting populations that had previously been divided among multiple political entities. These celebrations had to create shared national identities for people who had little common history beyond shared language and culture. The result was often an emphasis on cultural rather than political unity, celebrating shared heritage and common destiny rather than specific historical achievements. The success of these unification celebrations demonstrated that national identity could be created as well as discovered. German Unity Day and Italian Independence Day became vehicles for teaching populations to think of themselves as Germans or Italians rather than as Prussians or Bavarians, Piedmontese or Neapolitans. The celebrations helped transform regional identities into national ones by creating shared experiences and common symbols that transcended local loyalties. The 20th century brought unprecedented challenges and opportunities for national celebrations. 2 world wars disrupted traditional political boundaries and created new nations across Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Russian Revolution and the rise of communist states created entirely new models for national celebration that emphasized class struggle and international solidarity rather than national independence and democratic values. Soviet May Day celebrations exemplified this alternative approach to national festivity. Rather than commemorating specific national achievements, May Day honored the international working class and the global struggle for socialist revolution. The celebrations included massive parades that displayed military strength and industrial achievement, public demonstrations of loyalty to communist ideals, and cultural performances that emphasized collective rather than individual achievement. But even these internationalist celebrations gradually became vehicles for national identity and state power. Soviet May Day parades became showcases for Soviet military technology and Soviet cultural achievement. Chinese National Day celebrations honored both communist revolution and Chinese civilization. Cuban Revolution Day combined Marxist ideology with Cuban patriotism. The supposedly international character of communist celebrations couldn't entirely overcome the persistent human need for national identity and belonging. The decolonization movements of the mid-20th century created dozens of new nations, each of which needed to develop its own national celebrations. These new countries faced the challenge of creating national identity among populations that often included multiple ethnic groups, languages, and cultural traditions. Independence Day celebrations became crucial tools for building national unity while honoring the diversity of the national community. African independence celebrations often emphasized Pan-African solidarity alongside specific national achievement. Countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya created holidays that honored both their own independence struggles and the broader African liberation movement. These celebrations incorporated traditional African cultural elements while also embracing modern democratic ideals, creating hybrid forms of national identity that bridge traditional and contemporary values. Asian independence movements created their own distinctive approaches to national celebration. Indian Independence Day combined Gandhian principles of nonviolence with traditional Hindu and Islamic cultural elements, creating celebrations that honored both political achievement and cultural continuity. Indonesian Independence Day emphasized the unity of the Indonesian archipelago's diverse populations while celebrating their shared struggle against colonial rule. The Cold War period created additional complications for national celebrations as countries aligned themselves with competing international ideologies. National holidays became vehicles for expressing loyalty to either capitalist or communist values, democratic or authoritarian governance models, Western or Eastern cultural orientations. The celebrations often became as much about international positioning as about domestic unity. American Independence Day celebrations during this period emphasized freedom and democracy as alternatives to communist authoritarianism. Soviet and Chinese national celebrations showcased socialist achievement and international solidarity as alternatives to capitalist exploitation. European national holidays navigated between these competing models while trying to maintain distinctively European approaches to national identity and international cooperation. The end of the Cold War created new opportunities and challenges for national celebrations. The collapse of communist states led to the creation of new nations that needed to develop their own national identities and celebrations. Countries like the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and the various former Soviet republics had to create new national holidays while dealing with the complicated legacy of their communist past. At the same time, the growth of international economic integration and global communication created new pressures on national celebrations. How do you celebrate national identity in an increasingly globalized world? How do you maintain the relevance of national holidays when people's identities are increasingly shaped by international culture, global economic relationships, and transnational political movements? The contemporary era has seen both the persistence and the transformation of national celebrations. Traditional Independence Days and national holidays continue to attract large-scale participation and maintain their importance in political culture. But these celebrations have also evolved to address contemporary concerns about diversity, inclusion, environmental sustainability, and global citizenship. Many countries have redesigned their national celebrations to be more inclusive of previously marginalized populations. American Independence Day celebrations increasingly acknowledge the experiences of African Americans, Native Americans, and other groups whose historical experiences were ignored in earlier versions of the holiday. Canadian Dominion Day was renamed Canada Day and redesigned to be more inclusive of Francophone and Indigenous populations. Australian National Day has been re-examined in light of its impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Environmental concerns have also influenced contemporary national celebrations. Many countries have reduced the environmental impact of their national holidays by limiting fireworks displays, encouraging sustainable transportation to celebration venues, and incorporating environmental themes into official ceremonies. Climate change has become a focus of some national celebrations as countries use these occasions to highlight their commitments to environmental protection and sustainable development. The digital age has created entirely new possibilities for national celebration and participation. Social media platforms allow people to participate in national celebrations regardless of their physical location, creating virtual communities of national celebration that transcend geographic boundaries. Online streaming of national ceremonies allows diaspora populations to participate in homeland celebrations while also enabling international audiences to observe and learn from other countries' national traditions. Digital technology has also enabled more interactive and participatory forms of national celebration. Countries can now collect input from citizens about how national holidays should be celebrated, create crowdsourced content for national ceremonies, and use social media to encourage citizen participation in national conversations about identity, values, and shared goals. Contemporary national celebrations also reflect current debates about nationalism, globalization, and international cooperation. Some celebrations emphasize traditional themes of national sovereignty and independence as responses to globalization pressures. Others incorporate themes of international cooperation and global citizenship as expressions of countries' commitments to addressing transnational challenges like climate change, pandemic disease, and economic inequality. The COVID-19 pandemic created unprecedented challenges for national celebrations, as social distancing requirements made traditional large-scale gatherings impossible. Countries adapted by creating virtual celebrations, drive-through ceremonies, and socially distanced outdoor events. The pandemic also highlighted the importance of national cooperation and solidarity, themes that became central to many national celebrations during this period. These adaptations demonstrated the continued relevance and adaptability of national celebrations even in radically changed circumstances. Despite technological disruption, cultural change, and global challenges, people continue to value opportunities to celebrate their shared membership in political communities, to honor their country's achievements and aspirations, and to participate in collective expressions of national identity and purpose. Looking at the history of national celebrations across cultures and centuries, what emerges is a consistent pattern of human creativity in creating meaning, building community, and expressing shared identity through public celebration. Each generation has found ways to honor inherited traditions while adapting them to contemporary circumstances. Each culture has created its own distinctive approaches to national celebration while drawing on universal human needs for belonging, recognition, and hope. The future of national celebrations will undoubtedly bring new adaptations, new challenges, and new opportunities for expressing national identity and building political community. Climate change, technological innovation, cultural diversification, and global interconnection will all influence how countries celebrate their national identity and achievements. But if history teaches us anything, it's that humans will continue to find ways to create meaningful celebrations that honor shared values, build community solidarity, and express hope for the future. National celebrations remain important because they address fundamental human needs that transcend specific political circumstances. The need to belong to something larger than ourselves, the need to honor shared achievements and sacrifices, the need to express gratitude for the benefits of political community, and the need to pass on important values and memories to future generations. Whether expressed through traditional parades and fireworks or through innovative digital celebrations, the fundamental human impulse to celebrate national identity and community will endure as long as people seek meaning, belonging, and hope through participation in political life.